57 years ago, a family of 4 in Wisconsin vanished on their way home during a blizzard night, disappearing without a trace and leaving the entire community plunged into grief and confusion. Authorities at the time suspected a local young man might be involved, but with no bodies found and only a few fragile clues wiped away by the snow, the investigation quickly reached a deadlock. Yet throughout all those long years, one family member never gave up hope, clinging to the slim belief that the truth was still out there somewhere, waiting to be discovered. And then one day, when nature accidentally altered the water level of Devil's Lake, a crucial detail that everyone had once overlooked suddenly emerged, a detail powerful enough to turn the entire case upside down and shock everyone involved in ways no one could have imagined. Before diving deeper into this shocking story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you like this video, don't forget to subscribe. The winter of 1968 in central Wisconsin arrived with bone-chilling winds and thick snow blanketing the small towns along the hills near Portage. At night, rural roads were almost completely isolated, with only the faint yellow lights from a few farms blending into the cold mist. In that setting, the Hathaway family lived a simple life. Thomas, 42, worked as a machinery repairman for local farms. His wife Marilyn, a quiet woman who sewed for a living, their 2 children, Ely, 19, a first-year engineering student, and Lucy, 14, a high school student. They were known as a private family, not very sociable but proper and reliable. On the evening of December 14th, the lights in their small house remained on until around 9 o'clock, according to a neighbor living across the dirt road leading to the house. Earlier that day, Eli and his mother had been seen at a small gas station in Baraboo, where they stopped to fill up before heading back to Portage. The station attendant recalled a brief conversation, nothing unusual, just a family stopping like any other in the harsh winter. But the next morning, as the sun peeked through the snowy clouds, an unusual silence enveloped the Hathaway home. No smoke from the chimney, no sounds, and no sign of the gray station wagon usually parked in the front yard. A neighbor noticed the front door was closed, but felt uneasy when calling out and getting no response. By midday, Thomas's brother, who had a habit of stopping by every weekend, decided to check in. He knocked, called out each name, then walked around to the back of the house, but everything remained silent as if the house had been empty for days. However, there were no signs of forced entry or disturbance, which only added to his confusion. The worry quickly turned into nameless fear when he realized too many hours had passed without any news from the 4 people who should have been preparing for a normal day of work and school. After a few minutes of thinking, he returned to his car, his hands trembling slightly as he opened the dashboard-mounted phone, and at 10:15 a.m., he reported to the Columbia County Sheriff's Office that the entire Hathaway family had vanished for unknown reasons. Just minutes after the call ended, the information was relayed to the Columbia County Dispatch, where the duty officer immediately assessed the urgency and dispatched 2 patrol cars to the isolated house located about 6 miles south of downtown Portage. The sky was still leaden gray, with light snow falling but strong winds whipping, making access to the scene more difficult than usual. As the officers stepped out of their vehicles, the first thing they noticed was the empty front yard with no signs of movement, no footprints, no fresh tire tracks, just a smooth layer of snow covering everything evenly, indicating the surface had not been disturbed since the night before. The front door was locked, but not deadbolted from inside. Thomas's brother confirmed this was unusual because Thomas always deadbolted it every night. After calling out with no response, the police obtained permission to enter and proceeded with a safety check. A chilly atmosphere enveloped the living room as if the furnace had been off since the previous night. All furniture was in place, with no signs of pushing or searching for anything. A half-finished cup of coffee sat on the table, completely cold. The radio near the kitchen was turned off. There were no indications anyone had rushed out. In the kitchen, everything was in its place. Utensils washed and drying on the rack, no unfinished meals on the dining table. The refrigerator contained ingredients prepared for the previous evening's dinner, untouched. Moving to the bedrooms, they noted the blankets on Eli and Lucy's beds were folded, as if the two had left the afternoon before and hadn't returned to sleep. Thomas and Marilyn's bedroom was similarly tidy, clothes not pulled from closets, drawers not opened, everything suggesting no disturbance from struggle or break-in. The back door was also locked, but snow outside the windows obscured any signs of movement by anyone who might have left. Police checked the basement area, but found nothing unusual. No footprints in the thin dust, no pried windows. One officer noted the landline phone was working normally, cord intact, indicating no attempt to cut communication. However, the absence of all four people, combined with the missing station wagon, created an inexplicable contradiction. If they left in their only vehicle, why no note, and why had none of them been seen since the previous evening? After thoroughly checking the interior and exterior, only one clear conclusion emerged. No direction of travel for the Hathaway family could be determined from their home. All exits had been erased by overnight snow, making tracing nearly impossible. In the on-scene report, the patrol team leader noted that the simultaneous disappearance of four family members, along with the home showing no signs of intentional departure, fit the criteria for an unusual missing persons case per county guidelines. Given the event's severity and worsening weather, Columbia County Police activated emergency search procedures, mobilizing additional personnel from patrol and local rescue units. The initial search radius was set at 3 to 5 miles from the Hathaway home, focusing on routes toward Baraboo and the nearby Devil's Lake area, places the family likely passed through the evening before disappearing. Officers were directed to split into groups to scan snow-covered road sections, while contacting residents in the marked area for any observations related to the family's movements on the night of December 14th. This decision was issued at 11:32 a.m., marking the first steps in efforts to unravel the strange disappearance of the Hathaway family. Just over an hour after the emergency search teams fanned out, a patrol unit traveling along the winding road to Devil's Lake unexpectedly reported spotting a dark object standing out against the white snow, about 20 yards off the main road. It was the Hathaway's distinctive gray station wagon, parked at an angle on the shoulder of a rarely used trail, frequented only by hikers or occasional hunters in winter. As officers approached closer, they saw the roof covered in snow, but the overall shape was unmistakable. Long body, wagon-style rear door, and familiar Wisconsin plates, quickly dispelling any doubt about the vehicle's identity. The front headlights were still faintly on, a dim yellow glow filtering through the snow cover, creating an eerie streak on the wind-patterned road. This suggested the electrical system had remained active until at least a few hours before discovery, though the engine was completely off. The driver's side door was ajar about half an inch, enough to note no ice buildup on the inner edge, indicating it had been opened before the blizzard peaked overnight. The door handle had a thin layer of snow crisscrossing it, proving no one had touched the vehicle since snow began falling steadily the previous evening. From the wheel positions and angled parking, officers determined the car hadn't veered off but stopped controllably, as if the driver intentionally turned off the main road and pulled over. However, there were no long skid marks on the road. Snow had covered all potential signs of speed or trajectory. Surrounding the vehicle was a nearly 5-inch thick snow layer with no human footprints or drag marks. Officers scanned the ground with flashlights, but continuous snowfall had created an absolutely smooth surface, as if no living thing or object had moved in the area for hours. One officer crouched low, searching for any disruption in the snow, but found nothing beyond strong winds whipping fine snow into small swirls. The immediate absence of footprints around the vehicle was noted in the on-scene report, as it ruled out the family exiting normally and leaving tracks. Beside the car, snow on the tires formed clear contours, proving it had been stationary for a long time, at least since the previous night. One officer tried the driver's door. It opened without much force, not frozen shut, aligning with the initial observation of it being slightly ajar. Inside, through the slightly fogged glass from the cold, they could only make out vague outlines of the front seats and some items. but no one was allowed to interfere as the scene needed to be sealed per protocol. The search team leader immediately ordered a blockade of the area around the station wagon within a 10-yard radius. Yellow marking tape was strung around the vehicle, secured into the snow with temporary wooden stakes. One officer responsible for logging began marking the corresponding GPS position while sketching the scene by hand on large paper. All access inside the vehicle was suspended until the full forensics team arrived. Other officers expanded the check to both sides of the road, one following the trail into the woods, hoping for signs of human movement, while another scanned the land opposite the lake. But all noted only cold wind and undisturbed snow patches. The combination of the abandoned vehicle, faintly glowing headlights, and no footprints in the area created a tense atmosphere. None of the officers present could offer a reasonable explanation on the spot. By 2:20 p.m., the area was officially designated a key scene related to the Hathaway family disappearance, with all further access strictly following trace preservation protocols. No one said it aloud, but the station wagon's appearance in that condition and location raised more questions than answers. The one thing everyone noticed was the 4 people who had been in this vehicle were no longer there, and their disappearance could certainly not be seen as a typical getting lost in a blizzard. Immediately after the scene was fully secured, the documentation team began implementing procedures per Columbia County Sheriff's Office protocols from the late 1960s, a time when scene investigation relied almost entirely on film cameras, paper maps, and the manual observation skills of individual investigators. The on-scene officer, Lieutenant Harold Meyer, was the first to approach the outer perimeter. He removed his thick gloves, crouched to examine the snow surface before asking a colleague to prepare the 35mm camera, the type commonly used for outdoor scenes. In the gray cold light and constant crosswinds carrying snow, he had to open the aperture wider than usual to ensure enough exposure, then began shooting from a distance for wide shots. The vehicle's position relative to the trail, surrounding pine trees, and the intact snow covering the ground. He then moved closer, photographing from 4 different angles to capture the exact parking angle and orientation to the road. Subsequent photos focused on each wheel position, especially the left front wheel angled outward, as if someone had deliberately steered to pull over. Lieutenant Meyer used a tape measure to record the distance between the front wheel and road edge, noting each figure carefully in the scene log, anticipating potential errors as snow could thicken in minutes. Beneath the fine snow around the rear wheels, a faint tire tread pattern emerged when he gently brushed some aside with a branch. Though not clear, the distinctive curved grooves of mid-sized tires were recorded in the report. They weren't sharp like fresh tracks, indicating the vehicle had stopped before heavy overnight snowfall. Lieutenant Meyer requested close-ups of remaining tread segments, even if fragmented, as these might be the last traces not fully erased by weather. Strong winds pushed flurries back over the exposed areas, making the work many times harder. Gusts forced him to stand in front of the camera to shield the lens from direct snow. Changing weather compelled him to add a note to the record. Snowfall and strong winds limiting ground trace preservation. Additionally, the lack of modern shielding meant all activities had to proceed quickly, yet cautiously, to avoid accidentally creating new marks on the scene. Once basic exterior documentation was complete, the technical team began drafting the scene diagram on a clipboard with cardboard backing. Another officer used a compass to measure angles and mark the vehicle's direction on a north-south axis based on a metal compass. They determined the front end angled about 18 degrees west-northwest, a detail potentially useful when cross-referencing later travel data. They then recorded snow depth around the vehicle in inches to reflect the relative timing of the stop versus snowfall intensity. Upon completing these steps, Lieutenant Meyer shifted to preparing for interior vehicle examination, but maintained a safe distance to avoid disturbing undocumented traces. He inspected the door from the outer edge, not touching the handle, but assessing the gap in snowfall on the door crack. Officers were instructed to stand aside to prevent warm breath melting thin ice on the glass. Lieutenant Meyer noted the driver's door was slightly ajar outward, with no signs of being locked from inside, potentially providing insight into the driver's final actions. However, he emphasized no contact with door parts or interior until the full forensics team arrived with protective gear and standard sealing materials. To preserve the state, he had 2 small wooden planks placed under the chassis to prevent further snow buildup altering surrounding terrain. This had to be done very gently, as any vibration could cause snow to fall from the roof and lose layers potentially holding key information, such as wind direction at the stop or external impact traces. As the sun began hiding behind thicker clouds and light diminished, Lieutenant Meyer requested a final series of photos under weakening natural light to capture the scene closest to its discovery state. Upon completion, he surveyed the area once more, confirming no one on the documentation team had moved too close to the vehicle or damaged remaining traces. He then closed the log, signed confirming the timing, and reported to dispatch that the exterior scene was fully documented, ready for interior checks per 1968 trace verification protocols. Once the documentation of the entire exterior surface was complete, and the forensics team was fully present with specialized equipment, Lieutenant Meyer signaled permission to proceed to the next phase, opening the vehicle door and beginning the survey of the interior cabin. He put on thin cloth gloves inside, then covered them with rubber gloves outside, the type commonly used in the 1960s, though not as sophisticated as today's standards, before gently placing his hand on the door edge to avoid dislodging snow or further distorting any potential traces on the metal surface. As the door opened wider, a rush of characteristically cold air from the unheated cabin for many hours escaped, carrying a mixture of smells from the seat upholstery, engine oil, and something faint and hard to pinpoint, possibly just accumulated moisture. The driver's compartment of the station wagon showed no signs of major disturbance, but the complete absence of the driver and 3 passengers was immediately striking, especially given that the vehicle was found far from residential areas and on a road rarely traveled in winter. Meyer shone his flashlight toward the front passenger seat, then to the rear seats, searching for signs of personal items left behind. Only when the beam swept down to the floor beside the accelerator pedal did he spot a folded edge of fabric, apparently caught or fallen onto the floor. Upon picking it up, he recognized it as Eli's thin gray-blue jacket, easily identified by the embroidered name patch on the inside of the collar. However, what drew his attention more than the jacket itself was the long tear extending from the side up to near the sleeve. The tear did not follow a natural seam separation, but was twisted and pulled from front to back, as if a strong force had yanked the jacket off the body or snagged it on a hard-surfaced object. The fabric threads at the tear's edge were twisted into small clumps, suggesting it was not the type of rip from hooking on branches or light scraping. Meyer used a steel ruler to measure the tear's length, carefully noted it down, then placed the jacket into a standard 1968 brown paper evidence bag, avoiding plastic bags as they could retain moisture and degrade the fabric material. Continuing to examine the inner door edge where the hinge met the frame, he discovered a dark red streak along the curved metal, small but prominent under the flashlight. He carefully angled the light to confirm it was not rust or light reflection, but indeed an adhered paint layer. The paint streak was thinned at one end, showing signs of heavy abrasion against another surface before adhering to the station wagon door. Though its origin could not yet be determined, he surmised it was important evidence needing preservation in original condition. He used a specialized scraping knife to separate the paint in a shallow flake, without affecting the metal structure. The sample was placed in a small glass vial with a metal screw cap and sealed with tape bearing his signature. He added a label noting red paint streak, front door edge, driver side, date/month/year, in the exact format required by the evidence room. After sealing, he continued observing the front compartment. The driver's seat was pulled closer to the steering wheel than average for a tall man like Thomas Hathaway, based on subjective assessment from height descriptions in local registry files. However, this detail was merely noted without inference, in line with procedure against interpreting the scene before official analysis. Right below the gear shift, he found Eli's technical notebook, the hard brown covered type the boy often carried for noting practical exercises at technical school. The notebook was open to a partially written page, the last line stopping abruptly mid-formula related to resistance measurement, unlike an intentional ending. The page corner was lightly creased on the left, as if the notebook had been impacted or dropped onto the seat and replaced out of order. Meyer used tweezers to lift the notebook, placed it in a larger paper bag, and sealed it. Each piece of evidence was logged in the report: location, condition, collector, collection time, to prevent information distortion during transfer to analysis departments. After completing collection of obvious evidence, Meyer requested photographs of the entire interior from multiple angles: driver's area, gear shift, instrument cluster, rear seats, floor and surfaces, potentially retaining fibers, cells, or foreign substances. Though forensic standards of the era did not allow deep analysis, storing images was still useful for future comparison. The in-vehicle examination concluded with closing the door to its original state and covering with a protective tarp to prevent further snow entry into the cabin. No conclusions were drawn at the scene. Lieutenant Meyer only noted at the end of the report page that collected evidence would be sent to the county technical lab for analysis per procedure. He underlined the line, "No inference at scene," as a reminder of procedural rigor, ensuring all recordings remained neutral before deep analysis phase. After completing scene preservation and initial evidence collection, the investigation team's next step was reconstructing the Hathaway family's final travel route based on data gathered in the past 24 hours. This task was assigned to the witness verification officers, a job requiring patience, meticulousness, and the ability to connect disparate information into a logical timeline. The starting point was the small gas station in Baraboo, where the evening shift employee confirmed seeing Marilyn and Eli stop around 6:10 p.m. on December 14th. According to the account, they filled the tank and bought a bottle of windshield washer fluid, then left the station heading south, where the trail road toward Portage began. There were no signs they were hurried or anxious. Interaction was normal, and no one else was seen with them beyond the two observed. The officer noted this time as the first verified marker, backed by the retained payment receipt and matching description of Eli's jacket that day. Expanding witness searches to farms along the route from Baraboo to Portage yielded sparse but relevant observations. A farmer about 4 miles south of the station said he saw vehicle headlights sweep past the intersection around 6:35 p.m. As he was closing the livestock barn, though he couldn't identify the vehicle type through the narrowing door gap, the direction matched the Hathaway's path if they were heading straight back to Portage after fueling. This interval was entered into the temporary map, creating a relatively stable sequence: 6:10 p.m. Leaving the gas station, 6:35 p.m. passing Red Pine Farm. Residents deeper inland saw nothing due to bad weather and low visibility, but a man near the second intersection confirmed hearing a loud engine pass around 6:50 p.m. Likely the station wagon based on the deep tone of the old V6 engine he knew well. His statement was deemed reliable as his home was midway between likely passage points. As the team pieced these timestamps together, a probable route emerged: Portage Baraboo leaving gas station along County Road WC nearing Devil's Lake. The surprise was the vehicle found on the shoulder of the road into Devil's Lake State Park, a deviation from the direct return to Portage. This raised a major question: why turn west toward the lake instead of continuing home as usual? The team immediately returned to Baraboo for further subsidiary details that might explain the route change. However, no one recalled the family stopping again at any store after the gas station, nor reports of them with strangers. From collected data, the official timeline sketch was drawn: 5:40 p.m. Hathaway family last seen by neighbors at their Portage home before leaving in the station wagon. 6:10 p.m. Eli and Marilyn appear at Baraboo gas station. 6:35 p.m. Vehicle headlights seen passing Red Pine Farm on County Road WC. 6:50 p.m. Deep engine sound heard at Hickory Bend intersection. After this marker, no further statements confirmed the family's presence. This coincided with the finding that the distance from Hickory Bend intersection to the scene where the station wagon was found took about 10 minutes in good weather, but that night heavy snow reduced speed considerably. Based on team calculations, they estimated the vehicle reached the discovery spot around 7:05 p.m. or no more than 10 minutes later. This was considered the most precise loss of trace time authorities could establish without modern tracking like GPS or traffic cameras. The gap from 6:50 to 7:05 p.m. was marked red on the timeline map to emphasize this unaccounted period for what happened to the Hathaway family, the only segment without witnesses or supporting data. The team outlined three main possibilities for the vehicle's turn toward Devil's Lake: avoiding heavy snow on the main road, intentionally taking a less traveled route, or influence from undetermined external factors. However, they only recorded these hypotheses in the report without deep interpretation, per the rule, no inference without supporting evidence. When the complete timeline was presented to command, it consolidated scattered information into a coherent sequence, allowing clear ordering of the night the Hathaway family vanished. Leaving home in late afternoon, appearing in Baraboo as heavy snow began, traveling the familiar route, then unexpectedly turning toward Devil's Lake before complete loss of trace. The final piece here was Lieutenant Meyer's note on timeline stability, as each marker was reinforced by independent witnesses, receipts, or reasonable auditory identifications. With the timeline established at the highest reliability possible without automatic recording devices, the investigation team immediately moved to the next critical task: assessing the impact of the December 14th snowstorm on trace recovery potential. The entire scene from the Hathaway home to the station wagon location was covered in thick snow, making identification of footprints, tire tracks, or any surface disturbances nearly impossible. For scientific basis to support scene findings, Lieutenant Meyer contacted the Wisconsin State Weather Service meteorologist tracking the storm from early week. Per the weather report, snowfall intensity from 5 p.m. to 11 p.m. that night ranged from 1.5 to 2 inches per hour, with strong gusts redistributing fallen snow and overlaying all underlying traces. The expert confirmed that at intensities of 1 inch per hour or more, human footprints on soft ground or thin snow would be completely covered in 30 to 45 minutes. For vehicle tire tracks, deeper and more compressed, coverage might take a few minutes longer, but still not exceed an hour, with strong winds leveling the surface. The service recorded northeast winds that night at 22 to 27 miles per hour, sufficient to erase snow surfaces in open areas like the trail to Devil's Lake. This explained why the team found no footprints or drag marks around the station wagon, nor could trace any departure direction from the vehicle. Per the expert, such continuous strong winds could create living snowdrifts, new snow bands forming right after wind swept old layers, making surfaces uniform without prior movement signs. The team noted that at their arrival, the smooth flat snow around the vehicle fully matched meteorological analysis. However, snow's rapid erasure also meant any activity in the area 10 to 12 hours prior was completely wiped clean. When asked about possible remaining traces in other areas off the trail, the expert said this could only occur in naturally sheltered spots, such as under dense pine canopies, under rock ledges, or where terrain blocked wind. Vertical snowfall alone wouldn't fully cover ground under thick canopy, but wind-driven diagonal snow could still cover moderately quickly. For a footprint or tire track in well-sheltered areas, persistence might last 2 to 3 hours before full erasure. Based on this, the team marked 3 potential trace retention areas: the dense pine forest belt about 50 yards from the trail, a low submerged rock ridge a few meters below trail level, and behind a natural earth mound about 30 yards west of the vehicle. These were spots where northeast winds were partially obstructed by terrain, creating snow depressions less affected by swirling gusts. Lieutenant Meyer immediately ordered 2 police units to expand checks into the pine forest and rock ridge, not searching for bodies, but only movement signs, unusual snow depressions, freshly broken branches, or any dropped items. He also directed another group to probe deep into snow layers with rods to measure compression at suspect points, as varying compression could indicate snow pressed down closer in time than surrounding surface. Still, all were aware that searching for traces in ongoing snowfall was a time race with slim success odds. The meteorologist also provided further analysis of snow structure that night, noting temperature at storm start around 20 degrees Fahrenheit, dropping to 12 degrees Fahrenheit after midnight. This differential made lower snow layers more compacted than upper ones, creating 2 distinct strata. If an object or footprint occurred before deep freeze, the imprint would be in the lower layer, with lighter new snow overlaying. This could be visible under special light, but at Devil's Lake scene, strong winds mixed the layers, rendering the method inapplicable. After synthesizing all weather analysis results, the investigation team had to reach an unavoidable conclusion. All surface traces related to the Hathaway family's movement, or any individuals around the vehicle, were erased within 40 to 45 minutes after peak snowfall intensity on the evening of December 14. With confirmation from the weather team that the chances of directly tracking footprints were virtually zero, the on-scene commander immediately shifted strategy, deciding to expand the ground search radius using the traditional grid sweep method and mobilizing the maximum available manpower across the entire county. The large-scale search began at first light the next morning, when the sky was still covered by a thick layer of clouds, but the wind had eased slightly. Nearly 200 people were deployed in total, including more than 50 officers from the Columbia County Sheriff's Department, volunteer rescue teams from Portage and Baraboo, and dozens of local residents who joined willingly in the hope of finding clues about the disappearance of the Hathaway family. A search of this magnitude had never before been mounted for a missing persons case in such extreme winter conditions, but the decision was based on the assessment that every passing hour reduced the odds of finding survivors or preserving original traces before the environment changed further. The initial search area was a 3-mile radius around the abandoned station wagon, encompassing the trail leading down to Devil's Lake, the dense pine forest to the east, and the low rock ridges extending southwest. Because of the uneven terrain, the searchers were divided into 8 teams, each assigned a specific sector and equipped with paper maps marked with suspicious points identified during the prior weather analysis briefing. One of those teams, 5 officers and 7 volunteers, moved slowly along the edge of the pine forest. They probed through the snow with sticks to check for hollow spots, in case deep pits or buried objects were concealed beneath the surface. Whenever they found an area of unusually sunken snow, they recorded the coordinates and marked it with spray paint for more thorough follow-up later. In another direction, the team searching the rock ridge had to proceed step by careful step because the ice-covered stones were treacherously slippery. They examined every tree base and every crevice where snow might have accumulated unevenly. But for more than the first hour, their efforts yielded only a few broken pine branches and some snow depressions that had no identifying value. Although the weather was milder than the previous day, occasional strong gusts still whipped across the open areas, making the work both bitterly cold and difficult. Even so, no one lost heart. The disappearance of a family of 4 in the dead of winter seemed to instill in them a shared sense of duty that defied explanation. Near midday, as weak sunlight filtered through the cloud layer, one of the teams in the northeastern section of the pine forest spotted a small object protruding from the snow. A volunteer bent down, picked it up, and recognized it as a piece of green wool fabric with the distinctive stitching typical of scarves worn by teenagers in winter. The wool was thick, neither rotted nor heavily waterlogged, indicating it had not been there long. The snow covering it was only about 1 to 2 inches deep, consistent with the snowfall from the night of December 14th into the following morning. Upon closer inspection, they saw the edge of the scarf bore the embroidered initials LH matching Lucy Hathaway's name. The item was immediately reported to the on-scene command post. Lieutenant Meyer, who was in the area near the trail, came over at once to verify it. Wearing gloves, he carefully lifted the scarf to avoid dislodging fibers or allowing the warmth of his hand to melt the thin layer of ice on the fabric. Observing the pattern and size, he confirmed it was the type of children's wool scarf commonly sold at local general stores, the same kind Lucy was known to wear to school in winter. Though absolute certainty was impossible in the field, the hand-embroidered initials were so distinctive as to be virtually unmistakable. The discovery of the scarf was immediately classified as the first significant clue, confirming that the Hathaway family had indeed been in the area after leaving the Baraboo gas station. The scarf was collected, following 1968 evidence protocol standards, carefully placed in a paper bag to prevent moisture retention, labeled with the exact location, time, discovering team, and collecting officer, then sealed and signed. An officer added a note to the report that the find spot was approximately 900 yards northeast of the station wagon, meaning it was not in line with the direction the vehicle had been facing toward the trail. This suggested the possibility that at least one family member had left the car and headed into the woods, though no footprints remained to confirm the path. Upon receiving the full report, Lieutenant Meyer ordered all teams to expand the search in a fan pattern with a 50-yard radius around the scarf's location, specifically looking for additional items that might have been dropped along a route of travel. Although no conclusions could yet be drawn, the find reinforced the assumption that the Hathaways had entered the pine forest area at some point during the night they vanished. With focused effort, the teams continued probing the snow and the frozen grass buried beneath the ice, but aside from Lucy's scarf, they found no other signs. Nevertheless, the appearance of such a highly identifiable piece of evidence helped the searchers redirect their afternoon efforts and confirmed that the family had not simply become stuck on the road, but had moved deeper into an area rarely visited in winter. The discovery of Lucy's scarf shifted the search's primary focus to the pine forest and the low rock ridges surrounding Devil's Lake, terrain that was more complex but also more likely to preserve traces longer than open ground. Teams were redeployed to sweep deeper into the woods, where dense pine canopies blocked sunlight and the forest floor was somewhat sheltered from drifting snow. The first team to advance encountered gently sloping ground where trees grew close together, forming natural corridors. They probed the snow at their feet with sticks, looking for unnatural depressions or voids that might indicate someone had fallen. For the most part, however, the area showed only fresh, even snow accumulation with no disturbances. Moving farther in, they reached small rock crevices that ran along the hillside, dry in spring, but frozen solid in winter. These were dangerous spots where a pedestrian could drop through, especially when snow concealed the openings. The searchers had to clear snow in sections and shine flashlights down to check for any sign of clothing, belongings, or human remains trapped in the narrow gaps. Every time they spotted a dark patch, they paused to verify, but it was almost always just exposed rock or rotted tree roots. Another team followed the sheer western rock face, an area roughly 10 feet lower than the trail and sloping toward the forest interior. They tied safety ropes to large trees and carefully rappelled down to examine the ice-covered surfaces. This was a location where an accidental fall in the dark seemed plausible if the Hathaways had walked there at night, yet close inspection of every boulder and ice ledge revealed no evidence anyone had fallen. No freshly cracked ice sheets, no blood streaks, no scraps of fabric caught on the rock, all of which are common when someone is injured, falling from even a modest height. On broader slopes, rescue personnel moved in zigzag patterns, probing areas of irregular snow depth, but everything reflected only natural terrain, thicker drifts in small depressions, thinner strips where wind had scoured the surface. Experienced rescuers noted that a fall from above would almost certainly have left significant disturbance in the snowpack. Yet the surface here was so pristine and uniform, it appeared untouched by human feet since the blizzard began. They also checked the transition zone between forest and lakeshore, where tall weeds and small rocks might better preserve traces than open snow, but they found only ice-encased grass and cold stone, with no sign of trampling or heavy objects having passed. A separate team was sent even deeper into old-growth sections, filled with deadfalls and piled broken trunks, places where snow cover was uneven and clues were more likely to be preserved. They examined every root hollow and shadowed space beneath fallen logs, yet found nothing beyond fresh animal tracks, rabbit, squirrel, or deer, all more recent than any human prints could have survived the storm. Systematically ruling out each hazardous location, not just the crevices and steep slopes, but every high-risk spot, helped narrow the possible area while strengthening the assessment that the Hathaways were unlikely to have suffered a natural accident here. Places that typically cause slips or falls showed no trace of human bodies or discarded belongings. Lieutenant Meyer noted in his report that despite thoroughly searching the pine forest and steep terrain within the 3-mile radius, they had located no bodies, no signs of struggle, no torn clothing, and no personal items other than Lucy's scarf. Even as late afternoon light faded, teams made one final pass along the edges of the rock ridges to ensure nothing was missed. Every effort led to the same conclusion: there was no direct evidence the Hathaway family had fallen or slipped anywhere near where their car was abandoned. The complete absence of traces weighed heavily on the search teams because it not only ruled out ordinary accident scenarios, but raised larger questions about what had happened to 4 people in this vast snow-covered wilderness. For that reason, even though the forest, crevices, and slopes had been searched almost comprehensively, Lieutenant Meyer believed they could not yet exclude the possibility that the Hathaways had reached the shore of Devil's Lake before disappearing, especially since the route from the scene led directly down to the lake shore only a short distance away. He therefore ordered the search extended right to the water's edge and deployed the county rescue dive team, experienced in cold water operations though rarely called upon to dive in winter conditions as severe as those of 1968. When the divers arrived, they immediately assessed the lake's condition. The surface was not fully frozen, but covered by a thin crystalline ice layer broken into drifting plates by the northeast wind, creating dark open patches where divers could enter. Water temperature was estimated at just a few degrees above freezing, requiring thick rubber dry suits and the era's standard, but primitive breathing gear. Under Meyer's direction, they selected 3 entry points: 2 near the rocky shore, where depth dropped off sharply, and 1 in shallower water roughly 100 yards from the car. At each point, divers secured safety lines to steel stakes driven deep into the ground, both to mark their path and as a precaution against near-zero visibility underwater. As the first diver descended, they quickly realized conditions were far worse than anticipated. Thick bottom silt stirred up by waves and wind reduced visibility to almost nothing. Their underwater flashlights penetrated only 3 to 4 feet. Beyond that was solid black. They had to feel their way along the lake bed, searching by hand for anything with an unnatural shape, but mostly encountered only pebbles, rotted branches, or small scratched boulders moved by natural water action. At the second site, the team attempted a deeper sweep, where the bottom fell away rapidly, just meters from shore. Under water pressure and weak currents, they clung to their safety lines for orientation while lightly sweeping the bottom with their fins for large buried objects. Despite maximum effort, they found only loose silt and rock fragments. When they surfaced and reported, the officers on shore gained a clearer understanding of the era's technological limits. The sonar unit the rescue team brought, an older model designed more for depth sounding than object detection, provided virtually no useful data. It emitted weak sound waves with returns too vague to distinguish submerged rocks from man-made objects. One officer tried adjusting frequency and scan direction, but the screen showed only flickering, indistinct signals that could not confirm or rule out large objects on the lake bed. Lieutenant Meyer recorded this as an equipment limitation rather than evidence against the presence of objects. However, With the search racing against deteriorating weather, the lack of clear sonar images forced them to rely even more heavily on the divers' manual searches. Subsequent dives yielded no progress. At the third site, suspected as a possible drop zone for items from the high rocks above, the divers recovered a few broken branches and one large overturned boulder, but no fabric, metal, or any sign the Hathaways had ever reached the water's edge. The bone-chilling cold limited each dive to roughly 10 minutes. Divers had to rotate constantly to avoid hypothermia, further slowing the operation. Meanwhile, officers searching the rocky shoreline, where waves lapped against glossy black boulders, found no footprints or debris. The constantly breaking and refreezing thin ice had erased any chance of preserving surface traces. As daylight faded, Meyer reluctantly called an end to underwater operations for the day, knowing Devil's Lake was far too large to cover fully in just a few hours. At that point, all they could record was no bodies, no personal items, no signs of a fall into the lake, and 1968 sonar technology incapable of detecting large objects beneath the murky silt and water. The final consolidated report after the day's search stated clearly, no new clues recovered in the shoreline or underwater areas. No evidence the Hathaway family fell into the lake or was present near the water's edge at the time of the disappearance. Though it provided no answers, the lakeside and underwater search was still considered a necessary step that eliminated one of the remaining natural explanations for the mysterious disappearance of the Hathaway family. After completing the ground sweep, forest search, rock crevice checks, and lakeside survey but finding no viable leads, Lieutenant Meyer decided to shift focus back to the only physical evidence present at the scene, Eli's torn jacket and the driver's seat inside the station wagon. These were the scant few clues, but ones that could potentially provide critical information about what had happened before the Hathaway family vanished. That night, he requested that the forensics team bring the seized evidence to the temporary analysis room set up at the county center where they could work under stable lighting and without weather interference. The jacket was placed on a flat wooden table under the light of a desk lamp shining down on every torn edge. Using a handheld magnifying glass, the type common in investigations of the 1960s, they observed that the fabric threads were not frayed in the pattern of a natural tear typically seen when clothing snags on sharp vehicle parts or tree branches. Instead, the threads were twisted in a skewed pulling direction, forming long but uneven tiers, suggesting a sudden and strong external force applied to the wearer. The tear also started from the area near the side of the jacket and extended up along the sleeve, as if someone had been yanked hard from behind or struck against a hard surface while their body was moving in the opposite direction. Notably, the tear edges showed no signs of being caused by a sharp object, no cleanly cut threads or scorched edges, but were entirely due to stretching, indicating the force was mechanical rather than from a knife or sharp implement. An experienced technician commented that this type of tear usually only occurs when the wearer is yanked by a force greater than their body weight or when they struggle against a pulling source. The fact that Eli's jacket was found on the floor of the vehicle rather than on the seat was also noted in the report. If he had removed it himself to fix the car or step out in the snowstorm, it would likely have been placed more neatly, not twisted as if pulled off the body and dropped. However, no one was allowed to speculate beyond the scope of physical analysis, and all findings were recorded in neutral descriptive terms per procedure. While the forensics team analyzed Eli's jacket, another group examined the driver's seat. When measuring with a standard steel tape, they discovered the seat was pulled forward 2 to 3 notches closer to the steering wheel than typical for a man like Thomas Hathaway, described as over 6 feet tall with long legs. According to relatives, Thomas rarely adjusted the seat position, he always kept it fixed. The driver's seat was instead in a position more suitable for someone significantly shorter, possibly an average-height woman or an immature teenager. This was recorded in the minutes, not as a conclusion, but as an anomaly. One officer asked if Thomas had been driving that night, Why was the seat pulled forward like that? And if Marilyn or Eli had been driving, why were there no signs in the house indicating they had prepared for it? The unusual seat adjustment added another puzzling piece to the family's disappearance picture. To avoid speculation, Lieutenant Meyer ordered detailed photographs of each seat position mark, then noted the deviation from the average adult male standard. Afterward, he requested checks of the gear shift and pedal cluster for signs of recent use. The gas and brake pedals both had faint skid marks on the rubber surfaces, but it was impossible to determine if these were new or old, as this type of rubber wears easily with daily use. However, based on data collected at the vehicle discovery, the investigation team concluded it was possible the station wagon had been driven by someone other than Thomas just before it stopped on the shoulder of the trail leading to Devil's Lake. Another point noted, the steering wheel was not locked, the fuel gauge was still above half, and there were no signs of engine failure or mechanical issues, forcing the family to abandon the vehicle. This gradually reinforced the assessment that the Hathaway family did not voluntarily leave the car. When the technicians combined the two details, the unusual jacket tear and the driver's seat deviated from its usual position, they added a clear sentence at the end of the report, non-conclusive, but weighty, inconsistent with the scenario of the family voluntarily leaving the vehicle under controlled conditions. In other words, what they found suggested external intervention more than a proactive decision by the four individuals. Although the investigators clearly sensed these anomalies, per 1968 procedure, they were not permitted to interpret them as conclusions. All observations had to be recorded as physical facts, without any speculation. Still, in the minds of many present, the scattered details began forming an unacceptable picture. The Hathaway family was unlikely to have left the vehicle willingly, and the scene bore signs of external impact. It was precisely while hypotheses had to be set aside, pending further evidence, that the forensics team continued examining other evidence from the station wagon, and the red paint scrapings from the driver's door edge quickly became the focus of forensic analysis, one of the very few clues capable of indicating the presence of a second vehicle at the scene. The county's temporary analysis room, though limited compared to major labs, still had sufficient equipment for basic tests per 1968 standards. Lieutenant Meyer provided the sealed paint sample to the materials technician, experienced in analyzing industrial and automotive paints through chemical methods and layer structure observation. First, they placed the sample under an optical microscope to determine the layer structure. The red color was vivid, not the light red common on family vehicles of the era, but deeper, tending toward maroon at the edges. The technician carefully noted that the sample had three distinct layers, a light gray primer, a main red coat, and a thin clear top coat. Notably, this structure did not match the standard paint used on 1968 Ford family station wagons, which had lighter red, white, or cream primer, and thicker clear coat for corrosion resistance. After structural observation, the technician conducted chemical reaction tests with acetone and toluene-based solvents to assess solubility. The sample reacted more slowly than family vehicle paint, a characteristic indicating it might be formulated with alkyd or polyurethane compounds, types commonly used for commercial trucks, farm equipment, or heavy transport vehicles. He noted that this paint had higher durability and scratch resistance than personal vehicle paint, further supporting that the sample did not belong to the Hathaway station wagon. For confirmation, they compared it to paint scraped from the Hathaway vehicle's door as a control. Under the same magnification, differences were clear. The control red was brighter, with white primer and faster solvent reaction. The technicians concluded there was no possibility the red paint streak originated from the victim's vehicle itself. The next step was referencing standard color charts for common commercial trucks in 1968 Wisconsin. Though documentation was limited, they obtained a catalog from a local truck dealer listing standard colors for light and medium-duty trucks. Visually matching the color code to the sample, they found a clear similarity to industrial red used on trucks for agricultural produce or equipment transport, particularly in closed box trucks from certain regional manufacturers. This color's characteristics, high saturation, thin but durable clear coat, matched the analysis results. This was recorded as a key point. The red paint sample from the station wagon door edge was highly likely from a commercial truck, not any family vehicle. Beyond color and structure, the technician also examined the scrape direction on the surface. Under strong light, the paint showed abrasion from front to back, consistent with a vehicle passing alongside and contacting the door from the front of the Hathaway vehicle. This indicated direct physical contact between two vehicles with enough scraping force to transfer the truck's paint to the station wagon door. The scrape was not deep, suggesting a narrow contact angle and possibly occurring in a brief moment when the vehicles were close, not a severe collision deforming the frame, but sufficient to leave physical traces. After completing the analysis steps, the technician summarized the results and presented to Lieutenant Meyer. The red paint did not belong to the Hathaway station wagon. Color and structure matched commercial truck paint, the scrape indicated front angle contact, and there was no possibility the streak came from anything other than a vehicle with industrial paint. The report ended with a significant note. The red paint trace proves the presence of a second vehicle at the scene. This is physical evidence of direct contact between the two vehicles. No one in the analysis room said it aloud, but all understood the implication. The Hathaway family's disappearance could no longer be viewed as an isolated event involving only their vehicle. The presence of paint from another vehicle, especially a commercial truck, opened the possibility that the station wagon had been blocked, forced to the shoulder, or collided with another vehicle before stopping on the trail to Devil's Lake. However, true to 1968 legal procedure, the report concluded entirely neutrally, describing only the evidence and technical conclusions. There had been contact with an unidentified second vehicle. No inferences about the driver's identity, contact purpose, or sequence of events before and after the contact point. But for those directly involved in the investigation, the red paint had become the first piece proving the Hathaway family's disappearance was not merely the result of an accident or spontaneous action, but involved intervention from another vehicle at the moment they vanished. After the red paint sample analysis report confirmed the presence of a second vehicle at the scene, Lieutenant Meyer decided to expand the comparison of the sample with 1967 commercial truck paint catalogs, the most important reference at the time for identifying industrial paints. Since the county forensics room only had faded copies of some common color charts, he contacted 3 truck dealers in the Baraboo and Portage area to obtain original catalogs issued by manufacturers in the 1960s. By the next afternoon, they had assembled color catalogs from light and medium-duty truck makers, including International Harvester, Ford Commercial, Chevrolet C-Series, and some agricultural trucks painted in standard industrial colors. When placing the red paint sample against the catalogs and comparing visually under white light, the closest match appeared in the industrial red 47R from International Harvester trucks, popular on local farms in recent years. The color had similar depth, gray primer and low gloss, matching the evidence from the Hathaway vehicle door. One technician added that trucks using this color were often repainted with industrial spray methods, creating a harder, more durable surface than family vehicle paint. This reinforced the match between the sample and commercial truck paint, reducing chances of confusion with consumer paints. For certainty, Meyer ordered checks of competitor color codes. Some other reds were close in tone but differed in primer or gloss, making them incompatible. Notably, Ford and Chevrolet truck reds typically had white or ivory primer, not gray like the recovered sample. After eliminating other possibilities, the International Harvester chart became the only absolute match. The next step was screening the Portage area and surroundings for owners or operators of trucks with this paint. The Columbia County Vehicle Registration Unit lacked modern electronic systems, so lookups were done by manually flipping through registration ledgers. The 1967 1968 truck lists were thick printed tables recording owner names, vehicle type, registered paint color, and address. After over 2 hours of review, only 5 vehicles in the county were registered with International Harvester Industrial Red, and only 3 were the matching enclosed box truck models. Of these 3, 2 belonged to large agricultural businesses unlikely to appear on the trail near Devil's Lake on the night of the disappearance. The third belonged to the Faulkner family, owners of a small farm about 8 miles south of the scene. What drew the investigation team's attention was not just the Faulkners owning a matching paint vehicle, but their reputation for using the truck at night to move equipment between farm plots. Some locals had heard the truck engine at unusual hours, though this was not in official records. Lieutenant Meyer decided to verify by sending 2 officers to the Faulkner farm late that afternoon to inquire about the truck's status. As the officers approached the property, they saw the red truck parked near the barn, with dried mud on the wheel wells and body. However, since inspecting the vehicle required a search warrant, the officers only noted external observations and requested to speak with the owner. Brandon Faulkner, the family's eldest son, appeared and was cautious but cooperative. When asked if the truck had been driven on the night of December 14th, Brandon said he had used it to haul equipment to the eastern field, but returned early before the snowstorm worsened. There was no evidence to disprove this statement, but what the officers noted was his reluctance when mentioning specific times and his inability to provide witnesses for his return home that night. As the officers left, Lieutenant Meyer immediately added the note to the file. The Faulkner family truck was the only vehicle in the area matching the paint color and industrial type found on the Hathaway station wagon door. Though not incriminating evidence, it placed the Faulkner family on the list for closer scrutiny. For the first time since the disappearance was reported, a potential suspect emerged not from speculation, but from scientific evidence matching. Lieutenant Meyer stressed that this was not enough for any conclusions, but strong enough to redirect the investigation team's focus to verifying the schedule, statements, and truck condition of the Faulkner family in the coming days. Identifying the second vehicle type, along with the rare exact paint code match, marked a pivotal turning point in the investigation phase, opening the possibility that the mysterious disappearance of the Hathaway family involved not just their station wagon, but another vehicle present at the exact time and place, leaving undeniable physical traces. After determining that the red International Harvester truck, owned by the Faulkner family, was the only vehicle in the area that matched the paint sample found on the door of the Hathaway family's station wagon, Lieutenant Meyer decided to conduct a formal interview with Brandon Faulkner to clarify his whereabouts on the night of December 14th. The interview took place in the barn on the farm, where Brandon was repairing an old tillage implement, and the officers noted from the outset that he appeared tense, despite trying to act calm. When asked whether he had driven the truck that evening, Brandon replied that he had only used the vehicle in the afternoon, leaving the farm around 4 p.m. to transport tools to the eastern field and returning before dark because the snow had started falling heavily. He insisted that the truck had not left the farm after 5 p.m. and that he had been home for the rest of the evening. Lieutenant Meyer asked Brandon to describe more specifically the time he returned, but Brandon only vaguely said around before dinner without providing an exact time. This immediately caught Meyer's attention, because the timeline gathered from witnesses indicated that the Hathaway family's station wagon had appeared near the trail leading into Devil's Lake around 7:05 p.m. If the Faulkner truck had been moving somewhere between 6 p.m. and 8 p.m., the red paint streak could easily have come from a brief collision during that period. Not wanting to alert Brandon prematurely, Meyer continued by asking whom he had eaten dinner with. Brandon replied that he had eaten with his family, his father, mother, and younger brother. But when asked to describe the meal or the time they sat down to eat, he could not remember exactly, claiming that dinners are usually the same. This began to form a pattern of inconsistency, being present at home, but unable to recall the most important details that would prove he was actually there. To verify, the officers asked his parents, Mr. and Mrs. Faulkner, about the time Brandon returned home. Both confirmed that Brandon had been home all evening and had not taken the truck out after 5 p.m. But when asked what specific details they remembered to support that, they became flustered. Mrs. Faulkner only said that it was dark and cold, so everyone stayed inside, while Mr. Faulkner said he was certain Brandon had not gone out, but provided no specific reason. This lack of consistency led Meyer to note that all three statements were affirmative but lacked details, as if they were trying to give safe answers rather than describe reality. The contradiction became clearer when Meyer began comparing Brandon's statement with that of the employee at the Baraboo gas station. The employee remembered that around 6:45 p.m., while cleaning the fuel pump area, he heard the sound of a large truck engine passing by, heading toward Devil's Lake. He did not see the vehicle clearly, but the deep, muffled, and brief sound when shifting gears made him certain it was a medium-duty truck rather than a family car. Notably, this engine sound occurred at exactly the time the Hathaway station wagon was believed to have passed through the nearby area. When the investigative team asked Brandon further about this point, he completely denied it, saying he could not have been there and insisting that the gas station employee must have misheard. But the employee was extremely confident about the engine sound, as he had worked at the station for many years and was familiar with the sounds of different vehicles. Meyer included this detail in the report as a significant contradiction. Brandon's claim of not leaving the farm did not match the independent statement from the gas station. In addition, a farmer living about a mile from the Devil's Lake Trail also reported hearing the sound of a large truck engine passing by around 7 p.m. He did not see the vehicle because it was dark and his house was far from the road, but the heavy and prolonged sound was more like a loaded truck than a smaller vehicle. This, once again, heightened suspicion that a truck had been in the area at the exact time the Hathaway family vanished. When the officers returned to ask Brandon about this sound, he became defensive, saying that everyone around here has a truck, and that the engine sounds people heard don't prove anything. While his words were true to some extent, his demeanor changed noticeably, more tense, more abrupt, when confronted with the mismatched details. Meyer noted this as a noteworthy psychological sign, though not evidence of guilt. When asked whether someone else could have used the family truck without his knowledge, Brandon replied that the keys were always in the barn and no one else in the area uses it. But when asked if the truck had ever been borrowed by neighbors or acquaintances, he did not answer immediately, instead saying that that doesn't matter. Lieutenant Meyer identified another gap. If the truck had not been used after 5 p.m., as Brandon claimed, his argument that no one else borrowed it had no rebuttal value. Meanwhile, his hesitation over a simple question led the investigative team to mark that line in red in the transcript. At the end of the interview, the Faulkner family, upon being informed that the red paint sample matched their truck, reacted strongly, completely denying it and claiming that the paint match doesn't prove anything. They said the paint could have transferred to the station wagon from a different incident or from someone else's truck in the area. But Meyer noted that within an 8-mile radius, only the Faulkner's truck used this paint according to registration records. All these factors combined made Brandon's statement increasingly contradictory. He said he did not leave the farm, but 2 witnesses heard a truck in the area. He said the truck was not used after 5 p.m., but could not prove his alibi. The family denied everything, but reacted strongly upon hearing the analysis results. For Meyer and the investigative team, this was the first time they had a potential suspect, not only because of physical evidence, but because of the inconsistencies in the person's own statement. After the interview with Brandon Faulkner revealed numerous unresolved contradictions, Lieutenant Meyer decided to re-examine the crime scene photographs taken immediately after the Hathaway family's station wagon was discovered, before snow and wind completely erased all surface traces. Although the timing of the photos was not ideal, low light, strong winds, and continuous snowfall, these images were still the only data source capturing the ground condition at the time of discovery. In the temporary technical room, They used optical magnifying glasses to observe in greater detail areas of compacted or disturbed snow. In one photo taken behind the station wagon, right next to an area of snow smoothed by wind, there appeared a faint dark strip running horizontally, about 30 centimeters long. When enlarged, this strip showed slight depression, not the clear indent of a footprint, but a broad, flat compression, similar to a tire track partially covered by snow over a few hours. The difficulty was that the edges were too blurred, beyond the resolution of 1968 photographs, making it possible to identify the tire type only by comparing overall size rather than detailed tread patterns. The technician measured the width of the depressed strip based on the ratio to other fixed points in the photo, such as the distance from the rear door edge to the shadow on the snow surface. After calculating the scale, they determined the estimated width of the depression to be 7 to 8 inches, matching the average width of tires on a 1967 light-duty International Harvester truck, which were wider than those on the Hathaway family station wagon. This coincided with the red paint sample information, reinforcing the possibility that the Faulkner truck, or at least a truck of the same type, had been present at the scene near the time the Hathaway family disappeared. However, what made the analysis team cautious was the lack of clear tread patterns for confirmation. If the snow had covered more thickly or the wind blown stronger for just a few minutes at the time of photographing, all distinctive tire features would have been erased, leaving only the general surface depression. When further enlarging another photo taken from an angled view behind the vehicle, they noticed an additional depressed segment running nearly parallel to the first strip. The distance between the two depressions matched the rear axle width of some commercial truck models, but could not be determined with high accuracy because the snow surface had been eroded by wind by the time of photographing. Nevertheless, Meyer asked the technician to compare the distance between the tracks because if it matched the axle width of the registered International Harvester model owned by the Faulkners, it would be additional supporting information. After analyzing the photo scale, they calculated the distance between the two depressions to be approximately 55 to 60 inches, a figure within the standard range for the 1967 truck model. But as before, all calculations were limited by photo quality, preventing definitive confirmation. Although the faint tire tracks further supported suspicion that a truck had been present where the station wagon stopped, to include it in the official report, Lieutenant Meyer required describing the exact level of certainty. The depressions had sizes matching commercial truck tires, but were not clear enough to identify specific tread patterns or a particular vehicle. An important part of the analysis involved the direction of the depressed strip. Based on the shooting angle, they noted that the strip ran diagonally across the rear of the station wagon, not perpendicular to the trail. This suggested the second vehicle may have approached at an angle, passing close to the Hathaway vehicle before continuing along the trail or turning in another direction. However, because there were no clear exit tracks, the technician could not determine whether the truck stopped or merely passed by. Many hypotheses were jotted down in notebooks, but under the strict procedures of the 1960s, they were not officially recorded in the report due to lack of supporting evidence. Another limitation was the inability to determine when the tire tracks were created. Although the snow layer covering the depressed strip was thinner than on the surrounding surface, this only indicated it appeared before the snow reached its thickest level, but could not confirm whether it was made at the same time the station wagon stopped or by a truck passing hours earlier. This very limitation forced the analysis team to maintain a neutral stance. Although the faint tracks could belong to a 1967 truck, it could not be proven that they belonged to the Faulkner family truck or any specific vehicle. In the final report section on crime scene photo analysis, they clearly stated, faint tire impressions appearing behind the victim vehicle have dimensions consistent with 1967 commercial truck tires. However, due to the effects of snow and wind, tread patterns or specific vehicle could not be identified. This evidence is insufficient to determine the identity of the driver or involved vehicle. Despite the neutral conclusion, Meyer still sensed the significance of those faint depressions. They were the next piece in the chain of indicators showing the presence of a second vehicle at the location where the station wagon was abandoned, a presence that up to that point could not be explained by any statement. After analyzing the crime scene photos and determining there was a possibility that a commercial truck had appeared at the location where the station wagon was abandoned, Lieutenant Meyer decided to expand the investigation to private lands and farms along the route from Baraboo to Devil's Lake. The goal of this sweep was to determine whether any location in the area could have been used to dispose of objects, conceal traces, or show signs of unusual movement on the night of the disappearance. This was a necessary step, especially since ground and underwater search teams had yielded no further clues about the Hathaway family's presence after leaving their vehicle. The initial list included 12 private properties within a 3-mile radius of the scene. Among them were 4 large farms, 5 undeveloped abandoned lots, and 3 roadside wooded areas owned privately. Accessing these areas required obtaining permission from landowners or a warrant from the county sheriff. Most landowners were cooperative, partly due to concern over the mysterious disappearance of the Hathaway family, and partly to rule out any connection to their property. First, the officers checked low-lying terrain or areas with natural gullies where snow might accumulate unnaturally. They looked for signs of recent digging, unnaturally compacted snow, discolored soil patches, or plowing marks left by a truck. However, the thick snow layer and strong winds in the preceding days made observation more difficult. Natural gullies were all covered by fresh snow, indistinguishable from human-altered or weather-affected surfaces. At a large farm south of the scene, which had multiple empty barns and livestock sheds, the investigative team scanned every beer storage area, every hay and scrap wood section. They used hooks to probe under hay layers in case objects were concealed, but everything only yielded the sound of metal hitting hard ground. There were no signs of human movement on the night of December 14th or recently hidden objects. West of the route, a small wooded area owned by a family living near the Devil's Lake entrance was thoroughly checked. This location had dense canopy, less directly affected by wind, leading the team to hope that if any traces remained from the blizzard night, they might appear here. But after hours of sweeping, they only found branches broken by snow weight and a few small animal tracks. No footprints, torn fabric, or personal items. Another group checked lesser-used side roads connecting these private properties. They searched for unusual tire marks, but like the main scene, snow had covered everything, leaving a flat white surface impossible to distinguish. Assessing tire tracks on these dirt roads became infeasible due to deep snow accumulation, and any new marks created afterward were from police or landowner vehicles. Lieutenant Meyer noted in the report that they could not conclude whether any truck had passed through the area that night, simply because snow had erased all traces. When sweeping an abandoned lot about a mile from the scene, they checked natural pits, old wells, and depressed land areas. These deep pits could be disposal sites for evidence, but shining flashlights down revealed only cold rocks and thin ice layers at the bottom. No concealed foreign objects under the snow. At another property, with a side road leading to an abandoned barn, they carefully inspected every window, door, containers, and tarps blown by wind. All showed no signs of recent interference or use. The officers also carried probes to scan beneath the snow surface along soft ground areas, to detect any large buried objects temporarily. But the ice layer and frozen ground prevented probing to the necessary depth. Finally, they examined forested border areas where a truck could stop without being seen. This was considered the most feasible location for disposal if a large vehicle was involved. However, the snow surface remained intact, with no deep depressions or unusual snow-clearing streaks indicating a truck entering or leaving. Once again, weather made trace pursuit difficult. After all properties on the list were swept, Lieutenant Meyer compiled the report. No signs of digging, hiding, dragging, or disposing of objects in any checked area within 3 miles of the scene. no indications of a truck stopping at secluded points, and no direct evidence linking the properties to the Hathaway family's disappearance. Although the sweep yielded no specific results, it still played an important role in ruling out disposal possibilities within the search scope. Meyer noted at the end of the report that limitations due to weather, terrain, and elapsed time prevented the activity from generating new leads, but affirmed that the investigative team had thoroughly checked all feasible locations according to the standards of a wide-area search in 1968. However, as the search teams had scoured the entire forest area, rocky slopes, lake shores, and private lands within a 3-mile radius, the harsh reality gradually became clear. After weeks of effort, the investigation had not advanced a single step further. There was no body, no signs of a struggle, no new clues beyond Lucy's wool scarf and the evidence collected from the car. The analysis of the red paint flecks and faint tire tracks only indicated the presence of a second vehicle, but it was not enough to conclude any criminal activity. Repeated interviews with residents living near Devil's Lake yielded no new information. Everyone remembered that night when the snow fell so heavily that visibility was limited to just a few meters through the windows, and most had stayed indoors, avoiding the biting northeastern wind. No witnesses saw the Hathaway family leave their car, nor did anyone hear cries for help, sounds of impact, or any unusual noises beyond the howling wind and the vague sound of a truck engine that a few claimed to have heard, but could not confirm. As winter passed, and the snow melted in the spring of 1969, police returned to areas previously covered by thick snow, hoping that the exposed ground would reveal new traces. But everything remained empty. The rock crevices, wooded areas, water edges, and trails showed no significant changes. No personal belongings, bones, or torn fabric appeared, signs that a typical missing persons investigation might have a chance of uncovering with changing weather. The investigation team even tried rescanning some areas with old metal detectors, hoping to detect metal items like coat clasps, belts, or jewelry from the victims, but the detectors repeatedly picked up rusty nails, discarded cans, and pieces of wire fencing from local farmers. None of it had any value. Efforts to return to the gas station, nearby farms, and surrounding roads to recheck statements also yielded no benefits. Those who had seen the Hathaway family before they vanished had already said everything they knew. Further questioning only repeated what was already recorded in the reports. When Lieutenant Meyer attempted to expand the search beyond the 3-mile radius, he encountered practical obstacles, costs, manpower, and the case's priority level. Although the disappearance of an entire family caused public concern, there were no new clues to justify expanding the search over dozens more square miles. In many internal meetings, even the most experienced officers admitted that there were no specific investigative leads left to pursue without falling into unfounded speculation. About half a year after the search began, the case file gradually fell into a state of stagnation. Early investigators were reassigned to new cases, county resources were allocated to more urgent tasks, and the initial public interest, though not entirely faded, was no longer strong enough to drive costly, indefinite search operations. The Hathaway relatives continuously submitted requests for further investigation, but these were only received and filed away since police had no new information to deploy forces. Local media occasionally revisited the disappearance, but it still revolved around the same old details: the abandoned car, Lucy's scarf, the unidentified red paint streak, and the conclusion of no clear signs of foul play. Investigator Meyer, who had followed the case closely from the beginning, continued reviewing the file for many months afterward, hoping to find a connection among the scattered facts. But every effort led back to the same point: no bodies, no new physical evidence, no witnesses to the critical event, and no statements strong enough to expand into a criminal investigation. By the end of 1969, with no further signs that the Hathaway family could be found, the county police had to make a decision they hoped never to face: temporarily close the case file. In February 1970, the file was officially reclassified under Missing Persons Cause Unknown, with a note that an accident could not be ruled out, but there was insufficient evidence to determine criminal activity. This brief conclusion, though administrative in nature, was evidence of the complete impasse in the investigation over more than a year. The file was transferred to the Columbia County Archives, marking the end of the initial investigation phase and the beginning of a prolonged silence, during which no one knew what had truly happened to the Hathaway family or why they vanished without leaving any trace. 4 decades passed since the Hathaway family file was closed with the conclusion missing persons cause unknown, and the Devil's Lake area gradually returned to its inherent peaceful appearance, attracting anglers, tourists, and local residents each summer. Stories surrounding the disappearance were occasionally mentioned as a sad legend, but over the years, memories of it faded in many people's minds. However, in the summer of 2010, when Wisconsin experienced its worst drought in decades, the water level in Devil's Lake began to recede abnormally, dropping low enough to expose mudflats that had never been seen before. Many local residents curiously came to observe this rare phenomenon, and among them was a longtime angler named Robert Lindsley, who frequently visited the eastern shore of the lake. On an August morning, while walking along the water's edge to find a new fishing spot, he spotted a patch of metal protruding from the soft mud, positioned diagonally between 2 large rocks about 20 yards from the shore. At first, he thought it was just an old piece of equipment discarded in the lake years ago. Such things were not uncommon in the area, but the square shape and fairly large size made him stop for a closer look. As sunlight hit it, the metal reflected a dull red color, eroded, but still recognizable as old paint. Robert felt something was off, because this spot had always been underwater before and was not a place where people would easily dump industrial waste. Curious, he used a long stick to try touching the object. The tip hit hard metal and produced the familiar sound of thick steel. When he pulled the stick back, mud trailed in long streaks, revealing more of the structure below. It looked like the frame of a large vehicle buried in the mud for a very long time. An uneasy feeling made him step back, and he immediately decided to report it to park rangers. Within an hour, 3 employees from Devil's Lake State Park arrived at the scene. They used flashlights to peer into the mud, examined the shape, and took initial photos for documentation. The more they observed, the more they realized the object did not resemble farm equipment or boat debris as some had guessed, but rather the frame of a large truck. The mud covering every metal crevice indicated it had been underwater for many years, possibly decades. One employee suggested calling the police because the appearance of the object in an area linked to an old missing persons case could have significant meaning. Within 30 minutes, Columbia County Police arrived, cordoned off the area with yellow tape, and asked all civilians to stay back behind a safe perimeter. Lieutenant David Harlan, in charge of that shift, received the initial report from park staff and walked to the edge of the mud for a closer look. He noted that the exposed iron frame had a square shape and curvature consistent with the chassis of a light-duty truck manufactured in the late 1960s. Though he could not yet identify the exact model, the shape immediately reminded him of the old Hathaway family file, particularly the red paint analysis that had indicated the presence of a commercial truck on the night they disappeared. Although there was no direct evidence yet, this coincidence prompted him to request immediate reinforcement at the scene. Police set up additional stakes, established a wider no-access zone to prevent civilians from accidentally disturbing the surrounding mud structure, which might contain further important traces. A forensic team was called in, bringing more modern imaging equipment than what the county had in the late 1960s. They photographed from multiple angles, located the object's position with GPS, and marked mud points that might contain metal traces or related materials. From the initial images, it was clear this was the frame of a large vehicle, not a detached object. The incident drew attention from local media, and within a few hours, the usually quiet lakeside area became crowded, forcing police to set up a second cordon for order. Lieutenant Harlan, aware of the sensitivity of this discovery, repeatedly reminded officers not to make any speculations before the object was recovered. To him, the metal object in the mud could be significant, but it could also just be forgotten old equipment. All conclusions had to be based on evidence. However, upon examining the patchy red paint still remaining on the exposed frame, He knew they needed to investigate carefully, as this could be the first clue in 40 years related to one of Columbia County's most mysterious disappearances. Cordoning off the area marked the start of a series of subsequent actions, beginning with accurately identifying the object in the mud and whether it had any connection to the Hathaway family disappearance. Immediately after the area where the metal object was discovered was cordoned off, Columbia County Police coordinated with an underwater recovery team to prepare for salvage, as the low water level made accessing the vehicle frame more feasible than ever. A mobile crane was brought in from Buraboo along with specialized cables, while divers conducted a preliminary survey to identify safe anchoring points on the object. As the mud around the frame was manually cleared with tools, the metal shape became clearer. It was no longer a vague frame but a nearly intact truck, only deteriorated from time and decades of submersion. The red paint had faded to a dark rust color, but in some areas, especially around the door edges and truck bed sides, recognizable patches of industrial red remained, matching the 1967 catalog. As the forensic team rephotographed the remaining traces on the frame, they quickly realized this was not just an abandoned truck, but very likely the exact model from the Hathaway missing persons file. Lieutenant Harlan requested detailed images of the frame number at the front, hoping to find a VIN or any identifying code not completely corroded. After minutes of using wire brushes to remove mud and algae, they saw faint but readable characters. The sequence matched the registration for a truck owned by the Faulkner family, stored in county records from the late 1960s. This was the moment that made the entire team pause for a few seconds. The key piece from the old file, linked to the red paint sample on the station wagon door, now unexpectedly present at the bottom of Devil's Lake. Harlan immediately noted in the temporary report, preliminary identification, Faulkner family truck. As the salvage began, the crane gently pulled the object from the mud, producing a long screech as the metal separated from the lake bottom. When the truck surfaced, the rotted rear bed cover fell away, revealing an interior thick with mud, decayed leaves, and loose metal pieces. The forensic team and divers quickly approached to examine the cab and rear bed, using small shovels and thick gloves to clear layers of mud. Just minutes later, one technician stopped and signaled for the team to come closer. In that mud appeared the curved shape of a pale white object. As they cleared more mud around it, the shape became clearer. It was a human bone fragment. Immediately, the surrounding area was further cordoned, with officers ordering everyone to hold positions and avoid further disturbance. As the forensic team continued careful clearing, they discovered more bone fragments, several long bones, rib pieces, and a cracked skull section. Though identity could not be confirmed immediately, the presence of human remains in a truck submerged for decades made the investigators realize they were no longer dealing with a simple missing persons case. The truck bed showed deterioration along the seams, but the bottom was relatively intact due to the mud holding it in place. This kept the bone fragments relatively stable, not washed away by currents. One technician noted that the distribution of the bones suggested they had not fully decomposed in a strong water environment, but were likely disarticulated before falling or being placed in an already non-intact state. However, this was only a descriptive observation, not a conclusion. In the cab, they found additional rusted items, a metal lighter, rotted fabric pieces, and a metal ring that might be part of a key or tool. None were intact enough for user identification, but all were sealed for further analysis. When the truck was fully pulled ashore, police immediately set up a tent to cover it, isolating the vehicle and bed to prevent strong sunlight from drying the mud and affecting bone structure. The forensic team documented the discovery of human remains at the scene and transferred detailed excavation responsibility to bone experts. Before leaving the site, Lieutenant Harlan observed the frame once more, tracing the remaining red paint streaks on the bed edge. They were too similar to the paint sample found on the Hathaway family's 1968 station wagon door to be considered random coincidence. And now, identifying the submerged truck as belonging to the Faulkner family, along with the presence of human remains inside, turned the disappearance, considered stalled for 40 years, into a serious criminal suspicion. In that moment, the entire investigation team understood they were facing the biggest turning point in the case since the day the Hathaway family vanished without a trace. Immediately after the remains were recovered from the submerged truck bed and transferred to the county morgue, the forensic analysis process was conducted with the utmost caution, because if these bone fragments were truly related to the 1968 Hathaway disappearance, they could become the first piece to break through the wall of deadlock that had lasted more than 4 decades. The lead forensic pathologist, Dr. Harold Erickson, began examining the skull fragment found in the corner of the truck bed, where the mud had relatively well preserved the bone structure. As he washed away the layer of mud covering the surface and examined it under strong light, he saw a long crack running diagonally from the forehead down to the left temporal region. The crack was clean, continuous, and showed no signs of fragmentation from natural decomposition, indicating that the initial impact force was strong and concentrated at a single point. He described the crack as a linear fracture, typically seen when the skull is struck by a hard but non-sharp object, such as the edge of metal or a fast-moving flat rigid surface. This immediately ruled out the possibility of a fracture from random underwater impact, as water cannot generate sufficient force to cause a skull fracture of this type. Upon observing the edges of the crack, he noted that the bone edges were sharp but not heavily chipped, proving that the injury occurred while the victim was still alive or immediately before death, when the bone structure was still solid and had not yet undergone decomposition. The provisional determination of cause of death leaned toward severe blunt force trauma rather than any form of natural accident. Continuing the examination, Dr. Erickson found additional rib fragments and 2 long bone fragments that were broken but showed no signs of post-mortem damage. Notably, there was no water in the bone sinuses or evidence that the victim had inhaled water into the lungs before death. Based on the condition of the bones and the sediment layer on the surface, he preliminarily concluded that the individual did not drown and then get dumped into the lake. This was a significant finding, as it overturned the hypothesis that the Hathaway family had an accident and fell into the lake during heavy snow. The victim's death must have occurred before the body came into contact with water. As he continued to examine each bone fragment under the microscope, he discovered an even more important detail. Embedded in the crack of the skull was a very small amount of red pigment. Although the color layer was quite faint and had bled due to time, under angled light, the red became clearer. Dr. Erickson carefully took a sample, using a thin blade to separate tiny bits of material to avoid damaging the bone structure. After preliminary chemical processing, the results showed it was an alkyd-based paint compound, the same type as the red paint sample found on the Hathaway family station wagon door in 1968, and matching the commercial International Harvester truck paint catalog owned by the Faulkner family. The presence of red paint in the skull crack not only proved that the impact force came from an object coated with that paint, but also showed that the victim's head had direct contact with the painted surface at the moment of impact. The paint was inside the crack, not on the surface, meaning it penetrated the bone tissue exactly when the skull fractured. With this characteristic, Dr. Erickson confirmed that collision with the painted object was the direct cause of the fatal injury. This made the connection to the Faulkner truck more significant than ever, especially since the paint sample from the station wagon door and the sample from the bone had the same composition. However, following proper forensic protocol, he only noted the chemical match without drawing any inferences about behavior or the identity of the person causing the impact. Identifying the victim was the next step. The recovered bone fragments were in good enough condition to extract DNA samples from the remaining marrow. This sample was sent to a federal laboratory that assists states in analyzing DNA from cold cases. Although the bones had spent decades underwater, fortunately, the marrow in the long bones still preserved enough genetic material for testing. Within a few weeks, the results came back. The DNA matched samples from Eli Hathaway's relatives, which had been stored in records from the early 1970s, when family members provided information to police in their prolonged, hopeless search efforts. This result confirmed that the skeleton inside the submerged truck was that of Eli Hathaway, the 19-year-old son who disappeared with his family on the night of December 14, 1968. The forensic report clearly stated 4 points. First, the likely cause of death was severe head trauma causing skull fracture. Second, no signs of drowning. Third, the discovery of red alkyd paint in the crack indicated the victim's head had direct collision with a surface painted with paint, matching the Faulkner truck. And finally, DNA identified the victim as Eli Hathaway. This was the first forensic confirmation in the 4-decade-old case, opening an entirely new investigative direction after the file had been frozen since 1970. After the forensic results confirmed that the remains found in the submerged truck were those of Eli Hathaway, along with the discovery of red alkyd paint in the skull crack matching the Faulkner truck paint sample, Lieutenant Harlan immediately requested the reopening of the original evidence collected in 1968 for testing with modern technology. The red paint scrapings from the edge of the station wagon door, which had been stored under long-term preservation conditions, were sent to the Wisconsin State Materials Laboratory, equipped with spectral analysis equipment and molecular structure scanners, allowing for far more precise separation and identification of chemical components than the crude optical methods of the 1960s. The technician first used Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy to examine the polymer structure in the paint sample. The results showed a characteristic alkyd composition blended with red iron oxide, a typical formula for the industrial red 47R line used on 1967 International Harvester trucks. This matched perfectly with the paint sample taken from Eli's remains and with the 1968 case file paint catalog. But more importantly, the lab requested a direct comparison sample from the Faulkner truck salvaged from the lake. Although most of the truck's surface was corroded, they found a small patch on the inner side of the bed door that still retained a relatively intact original paint layer. This sample was processed using a scanning electron microscope, allowing analysis of the coating at thousands of times magnification. When comparing the 3 samples side by side, the one from the station wagon door, the one from Eli's skull, and the one from the Faulkner truck, the analysis results showed near-perfect matches in layer structure, pigment particle density, and trace metal composition. All 3 samples bore traces of the same red alkyd paint, with identical ratios of barium sulfate and iron oxide. The expert report stated clearly, the probability of random coincidence among the 3 samples is extremely low, nearly zero. This was something that could not be proven in 1968 through mere visual observation of color and gloss. Modern technology had irrefutably confirmed that the paint streak on the station wagon door came directly from the Faulkner family truck. After completing the chemical analysis, the technical team moved to the second phase, re-examining the 1968 crime scene photos with enhanced resolution using noise reduction and contrast enhancement software. Thanks to modern image restoration technology, they could expand details in blurred areas and identify collision edges that the naked eye could not clearly see at the time. When the photos were enlarged to a higher degree, the long scrape on the station wagon door, where the red paint was scraped from, clearly revealed a shape directed from the front of the vehicle, sweeping diagonally backward. The scrape band had a slight curve, matching the square edge of the International Harvester truck bed, which had a slightly inward-angled edge structure. The height of the scrape band relative to the ground was remeasured based on image correlations, combined with the Faulkner truck bed door height specifications, showing an exact match to the inch. When the contrast enhancement layer was applied, the minor metal deformation at the start of the scrape became clearer. The station wagon door was dented inward slightly, but enough to confirm physical collision rather than mere surface contact. This completely eliminated the old hypothesis that the paint streak could have adhered from accidental contact in a parking lot or minor static scraping. The technical analysis concluded that the truck had approached the station wagon from the front, with the bed side sweeping across the driver's door, leaving the red paint streak and causing metal deformation. Without image restoration technology, These details would have remained buried in the noise of 35 film photos taken during a snowstorm. However, the most important part of re-examining the photos lay in the positional relationship between the scrape mark and the station wagon's stopping direction. The wagon was found pulled unevenly to the edge of the trail, with no brake marks and no technical reason for a sudden stop. The direction of the paint streak on the door showed that the impact force did not come from behind, but from a diagonal front angle, suggesting that the station wagon was forced off course. Cross-referencing with the faint tire marks found behind the vehicle, the analysis team concluded that the truck had been moving parallel or nearly parallel to the wagon for a short distance before contact. All this data combined allowed for a technical conclusion that was unattainable in 1968. The station wagon did not veer to the shoulder on its own, but was impacted by another vehicle, specifically the Faulkner truck, creating a controlled collision that produced the scrape and forced the vehicle into the abnormal position where it was found. Lieutenant Harlan noted in the official report, the 1968 scene paint sample matches 100% with the Faulkner truck paint. Restored image analysis shows clear collision marks consistent with the structure of the truck salvaged in 2010. Physical evidence confirms direct contact between the two vehicles. This was the first time in 40 years that forensic evidence allowed the past to connect with the present, turning a once-abandoned hypothesis into a scientific conclusion that could withstand any scrutiny. After modern forensic evidence confirmed that the collision between the Faulkner truck and the Hathaway family station wagon was real, Lieutenant Harlan requested the formation of a technical subcommittee to reconstruct the entire movement trajectory on the night of December 14, 1968. By combining original topographic maps, crime scene photos, period traffic data, and three-dimensional computer simulation. Although the event occurred more than 4 decades earlier, detailed topographic maps of the Devil's Lake area remained intact in the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources archives, allowing the analysis team to recreate the trail shape, slope, visibility, and tree positions accurate to the time of the incident. First, they imported the 1967 topographic map into geophysical simulation software, then marked the location where the station wagon was found, based on 2010 updated GPS coordinates, and recalibrated it to match the old coordinate system. By overlaying data layers, they recreated the shape of the trail leading into Devil's Lake as it existed before modern widening. Next, they input the technical specifications of both vehicles into the model, weight, length, axle width, and turning radius of the 1966 Ford Country sedan station wagon and the 1967 International Harvester Faulkner truck. The goal was to determine how the two vehicles approached each other, at what angle the collision occurred, and how the other vehicle proceeded after forcing the station wagon into its final position. Initial analysis based on the red paint scrape and door deformation showed the truck approaching from the front and slightly to the left, sweeping along the driver's door edge. When simulating this sweeping force, the software produced a trajectory that forced the station wagon to veer right, sliding diagonally a short distance before stopping exactly at the position found in the 1968 photos. When calibrating the impact force to match the metal deformation, the model showed the station wagon could be pushed to the road edge without force strong enough to overturn it, fully consistent with the actual scene. After reconstructing the station wagon's trajectory, the analysis team shifted to determining the truck's path after the collision. Based on the map and trail shape, the truck had 2 plausible directions, continuing straight north along the main trail or turning right along a narrow dirt section leading to scattered nearby farms. However, dynamic simulation showed that if the truck maintained direction after collision, the sweeping force from the bed would cause the rear to drift slightly left before stabilizing. This matched a gentle curve northeast toward a secondary road leading to abandoned land near the boundary of 2 old farms, one previously owned by the Faulkner family. When the technical team overlaid the restored 1968 scene photos onto the terrain model, they found that the faint tire track behind the station wagon nearly matched the simulated truck trajectory after continuing from the collision point. Although snow had erased most real traces, The width, direction, and curvature of the tire track in the photos matched the simulation within very small error margins. When running the model through multiple scenarios, only the scenario where the truck crowded the station wagon and then turned onto the secondary road produced a trajectory matching the faint marks in the photos. The next step was analyzing where the truck might have stopped after the collision. Simulations using slope maps showed the truck could naturally slow in a low area about 0.4 miles northeast of the scene. When compared to 1968 private land maps, that area coincided with dense woods between two farms, with no residences and little traffic. This prompted the analysis team to ask, did the truck stop there, and if so, what was the purpose of stopping? When expanding the model to a 1-mile radius around that area, the software identified 8 terrain positions with sufficient cover, flatness, and reasonable distance for a vehicle to stop unseen at night. Of the 8, 3 were near the secondary road that once served as traffic between the Faulkner farm and northern abandoned land. These positions shared common features: stable ground, thick enough brush to obscure vehicle lights, and proximity to natural ravines, where evidence could be disposed of if needed. When overlaying the truck's assumed movement data onto the map, the model identified 2 areas meeting conditions for potential burial or concealment of bodies: an oval low area right below a wooded slope and a small forest bordering the Faulkner farm, recorded in 1968 as rarely visited. The simulation report concluded the post-collision trajectory of the truck indicates the vehicle most likely left the main trail and proceeded northeast, stopping within a range of 0.3 to 0.5 miles from the station wagon position. The 2 circled areas have high potential to contain traces or disposed objects. Lieutenant Harlan marked these 2 positions in red ink on the map, noting clearly, field survey required. This was the first time since 1968 that investigators had scientific grounds to determine the truck's direction of travel, as well as plausible locations where subsequent events may have occurred. After simulating the 1968 movement trajectory and identifying 2 suspicious areas located on land previously used by the Faulkner family, Lieutenant Harlan immediately proposed using ground-penetrating radar (GPR) technology to survey the entire terrain identified in the model. This was a method that investigative agencies in the 1960s had no access to whatsoever. But by 2010, GPR had become a standard tool for searching for secret burials or signs of soil disturbance. A team of geophysics experts was dispatched, bringing a dual-frequency GPR device that allowed scanning depths from 1.5 to 4 meters, depending on soil moisture. Before starting, they compared the 1967 historical geological map with the current one to identify areas with significant changes due to agriculture or weather. This helped eliminate regions with natural disturbances from decades of plowing or landslides. The simulated area where the truck likely stopped in 1968 was divided into 34 grid cells, each 10 meters wide, numbered from F1 to F34 for easy tracking. The GPR began scanning from grid F3, where the simulation indicated the truck's axle likely passed before stopping. Initial received signals were quite uniform, indicating the soil layer had not been heavily disturbed. But when moving to grid F7, a point right next to a small forest bordering a side road, the GPR screen displayed an unusual concave signal pattern at a depth of about 1.2 meters. This curve closely resembled the characteristics of manual disturbance, unlike natural subsidence or tree roots. The geophysics expert stopped the machine, marked the location with a plastic stake, and requested a rescan with higher frequency. The second scan produced similar imagery: an unevenly compacted soil area, symmetrical in shape, measuring approximately 1.8 x 1.1 meters, nearly matching the size of a human grave. When the data was reconstructed using 3D software, it was clear that the soil at that location had been dug up and refilled. What drew the investigation team's further attention was the compaction of the soil layer above the secondary sediment, indicating the burial was decades old, perfectly matching the time frame of the Hathaway disappearance. Lieutenant Harlan immediately requested expanding the scan to adjacent areas, particularly in the direction simulated for the truck's movement after leaving the station wagon location. When the GPR was pulled through grid F12, a lower area next to a natural slide slope, the machine emitted even more pronounced unstable signals than the first location. The screen displayed an elongated underground structure running diagonally, much larger than the one in F7. The signal depth was about 1.6 meters, and the broken wave reflection pattern indicated a hard or hollow object in the soil. As the expert increased image resolution, the reflection lines revealed an object with unnatural angular edges, not corresponding to rocks or tree roots. Harlan requested preliminary analysis, and the technical team initially concluded that location F12 showed signs of a large buried object, possibly a skeleton or multiple skeletons, as the GPR displayed uneven hollow areas, scattered in pattern, similar to cases of bone decomposition over time. This caused the entire investigation team to immediately focus on the two locations, F7 and F12. Both points were within the area owned by the Faulkner family in 1968, and more importantly, both laid directly on the simulated truck route after colliding with the Hathaway family's station wagon. Before deciding on excavation, they conducted cross scans from multiple directions to rule out signal interference or geological phenomena. After 3 independent checks, the data remained consistent. F7 was a man-made grave, approximately the length of an adult human, while F12 was a larger underground structure area, possibly containing multiple body parts. Harlan immediately drafted a request for an excavation warrant from the county court, stating that both areas showed unusual geophysical signs consistent with secret burial activity. While awaiting approval, the investigation team cordoned off grids F7 and F12 with red tape, posted no access signs, and set up shift-based guard posts to ensure no unauthorized entry. Forensic experts prepared excavation tents, sophisticated tools to avoid damaging any bone structures, and recording equipment to document the entire process for analysis. Tension spread throughout the work area. After more than 40 years since the Hathaway family vanished without a trace, for the first time, investigators had reason to believe that the remains of the 3 remaining victims were lying right beneath the soil in front of them. No one said it aloud, but everyone understood that if the GPR was correct, they were about to touch the largest missing piece of the case. The excavation warrant was signed late in the afternoon, and the Faulkner family land was about to be opened for the first time since the winter of 1968. Immediately after the excavation warrant was signed, the forensic team and geophysics technicians focused on location F7, the area with signals assessed as matching the size of an adult human grave. They set up a specialized tent to shield from wind and prevent direct sunlight from drying the soil too quickly, then began carefully removing the top layer with small shovels and brushes, avoiding any strong impacts that could damage bone structures. The soil at F7 was quite uniform, indicating no intervention for decades, but when digging down more than half a meter, the soil color began to change. The natural layer shifted to a lighter brown, looser and less cohesive, characteristic of soil that had been dug up and refilled. Continuing to a depth of about 1.1 meters, the technician's brush touched a hard, curved object. After brushing away a few more layers, an ivory-white surface appeared, distinctly different from the surrounding soil. Dr. Erickson leaned in to examine and confirmed it was the femur of an adult human. The excavation shifted to bone recovery, with thin layers of soil removed to avoid scattering the bones. As the lower half of the body was exposed, they discovered additional pelvic bones and left ribs, indicating the skeleton was in a slightly curled position, common in hasty burials. When the skull was located, its decomposition state matched Eli's bones, thin with small cracks, but no signs of direct fracture from a heavy object. Next came DNA sampling for comparison. Molar teeth and long bone samples were selected for submission to the state lab. While awaiting results, the forensic team continued evaluating bone marks, a long crack on the arm bone, not sharp, indicating strong force, but not complete fracture. a depression on the seventh rib consistent with impact from a large surface object. This matched Eli's injury pattern, suggesting this victim also suffered similar force at approximate time. When measuring bones and cross-referencing with 1968 anthropometric records, femur length, pelvic width, and skull structure matched Marilyn Hathaway, the mother in the family. The skeleton was then sealed and transferred to the Central Identification Facility. Meanwhile, the other team moved to location F12, where GPR detected a larger, elongated underground structure with signs of multiple bone fragments. This site was harder to excavate due to low-lying soil, prone to wall collapse, so they dug in small sections. At a depth of 1.4 meters, they began finding scattered small bone fragments, a vertebra, a child's rib segment, and an arm bone fragment half the size of an adult's. The technicians paused to assess whether these were child remains. When a small jawbone with incomplete baby teeth was exposed, the answer was clear. These were very likely the remains of Lucy Hathaway, the 8-year-old daughter who disappeared with her brother and mother. Lucy's skeleton was not as intact as Marilyn's. Bone fragments were slightly displaced, possibly due to long-term decomposition in moist soil. However, anatomical features, including long bone size, jaw curvature, and child skull suture lines, perfectly matched a child of Lucy's age. Among the recovered bones, two notable points stood out: a thin fracture line across the forehead on the skull, similar to mild impact or being thrown against a hard surface, and an unnatural curve on the right radius, not due to decomposition, but resembling impact curvature while the victim was alive. This helped the examiners conclude that Lucy's cause of death occurred near the time of Eli's and Marilyn's, not afterward. After recovering all bones, the investigation team analyzed the surrounding soil at F12 for signs of prolonged disturbance or buried accompanying objects. Several small decayed fabric fragments, dark green in color, were found near the leg bones, most likely remnants of the wool coat Lucy wore on the day of disappearance, as described in the 1968 report. Though no longer intact, these fabric pieces were collected for further analysis. Within 2 weeks, DNA results from both locations were returned. The F7 skeleton DNA matched 99.9% with Marilyn Hathaway's relatives. The F12 sample matched Lucy's relatives. The official report stated, the two skeletons excavated at locations F7 and F12 are those of Marilyn Hathaway and Lucy Hathaway. The forensic report also confirmed both died at the same time as Eli, based on equivalent decomposition levels and similar bone impact injuries. There was no doubt left. These were the remains of the last two victims from the 1968 disappearance. With the discovery and confirmation of Marilyn's and Lucy's remains, the major piece in what seemed an unsolvable case was placed on the table. The entire Hathaway family had died at the same time due to external force, and their bodies were hidden within land, then used by the Faulkner family. After confirming the two skeletons at locations F7 and F12 as Marilyn and Lucy Hathaway, Lieutenant Harlan decided to expand the survey radius, particularly along the simulated truck trajectory after leaving the Faulkner land on the night of December 14, 1968. An old map segment showed a narrow dirt road extending nearly a mile southeast, leading to an area once used as an abandoned farm equipment dump for two farms inactive since the 1950s. This area had long been unused, overgrown with vegetation, uneven ground with many natural sinkholes formed by rain and rotting tree stumps. Due to its low traffic, it was assessed as a plausible site for concealing evidence or bodies undetected for decades. When the geophysics team brought GPR to scan the area, most signals reflected natural terrain. However, at a point about 1 mile from the Faulkner land, GPR recorded an unusual oval response area at nearly 1 meter depth. Unlike the previous two locations, the signal here was mixed, showing both old dig characteristics and stronger reflections indicating solid metal objects. Lieutenant Harlan immediately requested marking the location coding it T1, and preparing for a small-scale excavation per procedure. Due to sinkhole risks and thick roots, the technical team took nearly an hour to clear the surface before digging to the required depth. At about 80 centimeters, a moist soil smell mixed with faint long-term organic decay began rising. Just minutes later, a technician's brush touched a large curved bone, identified as an adult human rib. Continuing carefully, they uncovered arm bones, leg bones, and finally a skull tilted to one side. The skull had a severe fracture in the occipital region, larger than Eli's and Marilyn's, but with radiating pattern, indicating strong force vertically or from behind. When lifting the skull, Dr. Erickson immediately noticed a thin gray-silver metal residue layer adhered to the bone surface, unlike the red paint seen on Eli. This raised curiosity, as such metal did not fit natural burial or environmental effects. For clarity, he requested separating small metal fragments embedded in the skull fracture grooves and sealing them in bags. Digging a few more centimeters deeper, the team reached a larger metal object, an old rearview mirror fragment, curved like a truck mirror, with rusted frame but retaining the distinctive 1960s external truck mirror shape. Notably, the inner mirror edge was sharp but slightly bent, consistent with strong impact against a hard object. Dr. Erickson closely observed and concluded this mirror fragment could be the object causing the skull injury, as its curvature and edge width matched the fracture direction and size. When samples were sent to the lab and analyzed via spectroscopy, the mirror's metal composition, aluminum alloy chrome-plated, perfectly matched standard rearview mirrors on 1967 International Harvester trucks. This match made the metal piece the most critical evidence from T1. Meanwhile, the investigation team cross-referenced anthropometric data of the newly discovered body with Hathaway family records. Femur length, shoulder width, and skull size all matched Thomas Hathaway, the 42-year-old father who disappeared with his wife and children. DNA testing from long bones confirmed match with 1970s relative samples. No doubt remained, the fourth body was Thomas Hathaway. What particularly drew the team's attention was the preliminary cause of death from bone marks. The skull injury perfectly matched the mirror edge shape, and histological analysis showed the fracture occurred while alive or immediately at death. No other major injuries, indicating the single rear head blow likely caused instant or near-instant death. Unlike Marilyn's and Lucy's burial site, Thomas's body was not at the same location, but nearly a mile away, in an old pit showing additional 1968 digging and refilling. The excavation report noted it was once a small farm equipment pit, abandoned long before the disappearance. Surrounding soil analysis showed disturbance timing matching the Hathaway disappearance date. Finding Thomas's body with the 1967 truck mirror fragment nearby, especially with the entire family confirmed dead from external force, turned this quiet land into the heaviest evidence proving direct link between all four victims' deaths and the truck owned by the Faulkner family. With this discovery, the fragmented 40-year picture began to clarify. Each Hathaway family member was killed at different locations, then hidden at separate points, but all along the same vehicle's movement path. Based on the entirety of forensic evidence, terrain simulations, excavated physical evidence, and data from the original 1968 records, the investigation team conducted a reconstruction of the events of the night of December 14th, with the greatest level of detail since the case was reopened. The simulation steps were cross-referenced piece by piece with the old statements from the Faulkner family, the burial locations, the discovery site of the submerged truck, and the paint samples that matched 100% between the two vehicles. The reconstruction results show that the chain of events began sometime after 7 p.m. on the trail leading into Devil's Lake, where the Hathaway family's station wagon was last seen. In the model, Eli Hathaway most likely exited the vehicle before the other members, possibly to check the condition of the vehicle, or to survey the road ahead as snow fell heavily, while the wagon was moving slowly against the wind. At the same time, The Faulkner family's International Harvester truck, driven by Brandon, was traveling south from Baraboo. The paint transfer marks on the station wagon's door and Eli's skull fracture both indicate that the truck did not merely graze past, but struck at sufficient speed, causing the truck bed side to sweep into Eli, delivering a powerful impact directly to the skull and resulting in near instantaneous death. The simulated impact force matches the skull fracture found in the submerged truck bed, and the amount of red paint adhered to the bone proves that Eli was struck directly by the metal body of the Faulkner truck, rather than being thrown to the ground first. After the collision, the station wagon was forced off to the edge of the road and came to a stop without brake marks. The stopping position matches the skid direction from the reconstruction simulation. The Hathaway family, Thomas, Marilyn, and little Lucy, may have been inside the vehicle or very nearby, realizing that Eli was gravely injured or already dead. According to the scenario model, they immediately got out of the car to look for Eli. This is the point where the events led to confrontation. Based on multiple factors, including the distribution of bone fragments, impact direction, and distances between where Eli's body was found and where Marilyn and Lucy's remains were discovered, the investigation team reconstructed that the Hathaway family directly confronted Brandon Faulkner right after the impact. Brandon, in his old statements, always insisted he was not in the area and had never had contact with the Hathaway family, but the analysis results show he stopped the truck, saw Eli injured, and was questioned by the Hathaway family. The nature of the collision, combined with the station wagon being forced to the roadside, made it impossible for Brandon to intend to leave without taking responsibility, as the family had witnessed the entire incident. Conflict very likely arose right there on the deserted road, in blizzard conditions that limited visibility and with no other witnesses present. Based on the opposing injuries among the victims, the reconstruction team concluded that the conflict escalated rapidly. Thomas, the father, most likely tried to approach the truck's door or demanded that Brandon take Eli to the hospital. This aligns with Thomas's body having a severe fracture to the back of the skull, corresponding to a blow from behind that matched the pattern created by the rearview mirror fragment found next to his body. This is evidence that Brandon used the truck's own accessory to attack. When Thomas collapsed, Marilyn and Lucy became the only remaining witnesses to the event and may have cried for help or tried to run back toward the station wagon. Investigators believe that Brandon, in panic and fearing charges for causing Eli's death, continued attacking the two remaining individuals to silence them. The skull fractures in Marilyn and Lucy show they suffered similar but less forceful impacts than Thomas, consistent with the hypothesis that they were attacked quickly and decisively while trying to escape. After the other three family members were killed, Brandon faced the decision of how to handle the aftermath. Simulations of the travel route and later body discoveries proved that the disposal process was calculated and took advantage of terrain familiar from the Faulkner family land. First, he loaded Eli's body into the truck bed, where bone traces and mud in the bed confirmed the body left marks for several hours before the truck sank. He then moved the Hathaway family's station wagon to an offset position on the roadside, leaving the scene without clear footprints due to the snowfall, and drove away with the three remaining bodies, burying Marilyn and Lucy at two nearby but separate locations rather than in one grave. Shows Brandon wanted to scatter the bodies to reduce the chances of discovery. Both pits F7 and F12 were on Faulkner family land at the time, in low-traffic areas not visible from the main road. Thomas was buried farther away, nearly a mile, in an old pit that had once stored farm tools, an ideal spot to refill without leaving unusual traces. Brandon's final action that night was to dispose of the truck itself, the most dangerous piece of evidence. The simulated trajectory and the truck's discovery under the lake show that Brandon drove it to the shore of Devil's Lake when water levels were high, and either let it drift into the water or intentionally pushed it down, using momentum. The truck sank deep into the mud and was never discovered until the 2010 drought caused the water to recede. With all the data, the reconstructed events show that the night of December 14, 1968, was a chain of incidents that began with an accidental collision, escalated into direct confrontation, and then led to intentional murder and evidence concealment to cover up the crime. The full reconstruction of the events of the night of December 14, 1968, allowed the investigation team for the first time in over 4 decades to see the complete picture of the case. But to present it to the Wisconsin state prosecutor, they needed to turn all the scattered data into a structured charging document supported by comprehensive physical evidence, forensic evidence, spatial analysis, and technical conclusions. Lieutenant Harlan directed the team to compile starting with the hard physical evidence, as this was the indisputable foundation. First was the red paint traces, 3 samples from the station wagon door, from Eli's skull, and from the Faulkner truck, analyzed using modern spectroscopy, matching perfectly in alkyd composition, iron oxide pigments, and paint layer structure, confirming the Faulkner truck was the only vehicle in the area with this paint type. Next was the metal deformation analysis on the station wagon door, the paint scrape and dent depth, matching the edge of the 1967 International Harvester truck bed, impossible for any other vehicle. Faint tire tracks in 1968 photos, when contrast enhanced, displayed width and direction consistent with the Faulkner truck's simulated travel path. Soil samples taken from under the wagon and the impact site also contain mineral grains identical to the Faulkner farm area, strengthening the argument that the collision occurred near the farm boundary rather than on a public road. Moving to the body evidence, the file became even heavier. Eli's body found in the submerged truck bed had a skull fracture typical of high-force impact from a large surface object. The red paint layer in the fracture groove proves the victim's head struck the Faulkner truck body directly while still alive or at the moment of death. Marilyn and Lucy, found at sites F7 and F12, both had similar bone damage in force type and degree. Time of death for both matched Eli's, with no signs of death by exposure or accident. DNA confirmed identities, verifying all 3 bodies belonged to the Hathaway family. Thomas's body, discovered at site T1, had a severe rear skull fracture perfectly matching the edge of a 1967 truck rearview mirror. The mirror fragment found right beside him. Histological analysis confirmed the blow occurred while the victim was alive. Not only a sign of violence, the mirror fragment also matched the alloy and structure of genuine International Harvester parts. This made the evidence direct proof of the killing. In addition to forensic evidence, the team included geographic data chains in the file. Truck trajectory simulations show it forced the station wagon to the roadside, continued onto Faulkner land, and stopped in the area identified by GPR, where Marilyn and Lucy's bodies were found. This path is the only one consistent with 1968 terrain and burial locations. The truck sinking under Devil's Lake fits the intent to dispose of the vehicle, especially since it was pushed in when water was deep and remained undiscovered until the 2010 drought. The file also included all of Brandon Faulkner's contradictory 1968 statements, his claimed timeline of the truck never leaving the farm completely mismatched witness, accounts of hearing the truck engine heading toward Devil's Lake, his hesitation when asked about dinner time, the Faulkner family's insistence he was home, but without specific details, and especially his defensive reaction when asked about the red paint streak. Each small contradiction alone was not enough to charge, but combined with physical evidence, they became a pattern of behavior aimed at concealing the truth. To ensure logical flow, the investigation team arranged all the pieces in chronological order. 1 collision causing Eli's death, 2 confrontation between the Hathaway family and Brandon, 3 violent acts leading to the deaths of Thomas, Marilyn, and Lucy, 4 scattering bodies at 3 locations to avoid detection, 5 disposing of the truck by pushing it into Devil's Lake, 6 leaving the station wagon as a staged scene to simulate a natural disappearance. This sequence of events was reinforced by all forensic results, from bone analysis, materials, geophysics, to motion modeling. The compiled document, over 600 pages, was completed after 3 weeks, including restored photos, charts, technical conclusions, and additional expert statements. Before submitting the file to the prosecutor, Lieutenant Harlan held a closed meeting in which the forensic team confirmed that no evidence in the entire case contradicted the hypothesis that Brandon Faulkner caused the full chain of events. When the district attorney reviewed the charging document, he paid particular attention to 3 factors: the direct link between the vehicle and the victim's injuries, the body locations perfectly matching the vehicle's travel path, and the disposal of the vehicle, an action that only makes sense for someone intending to conceal a crime. After cross-checking all evidence, the prosecutor concluded that conditions were met to charge first-degree murder under Wisconsin law. That day, he signed the formal charging order against Brandon Faulkner, the first time in the case's history that a name was legally tied to responsibility after more than 40 years of deadlock. The arrest warrant for Brandon Faulkner was issued on the morning of September 14, 2010, just hours after the district attorney signed the charging document based on the completed chain of forensic evidence and terrain simulations. The warrant was sent directly to the Columbia County Sheriff's Office, and the execution team led by Lieutenant Harlan was deployed with strict orders to maintain secrecy to prevent Brandon from fleeing or destroying additional case-related materials. Based on surveillance information from the previous weeks, they determined Brandon was currently working for an agricultural transport company south of Portage and typically started his shift at 6 a.m. Around 6:20 a.m., 3 unmarked patrol vehicles were dispatched to the company parking lot. Brandon was seen checking tie-down straps on a grain truck, unaware of the signed arrest warrant. As the execution team approached, Lieutenant Harlan stepped forward first, introduced himself, and announced the arrest under first-degree murder charges. Brandon was completely stunned, standing motionless for several seconds before 2 officers instructed him to turn around for cuffing. He did not resist, only repeatedly asking, "What is this about?" but received no answer beyond the need to follow procedure. Nearby employees were shocked witnessing Brandon being cuffed and led away, as for years he had been known as a hard-working, quiet worker who never caused trouble. All actions by the execution team were carried out quickly to avoid drawing a crowd. Immediately after Brandon was placed in the vehicle, 2 other police teams conducted searches of his home at the Faulkner farm, though ownership had changed. Brandon still retained use of some old storage buildings. The search warrant was issued to look for documents, notes, or remaining evidence related to the 1967 International Harvester truck, travel routes on the night of the incident, or proof of Brandon's presence at the scene in 1968. In the storage building behind the main house, they found an old wooden crate containing assorted documents, truck maintenance records from the 1960s, a repair invoice for a rearview mirror, and a dark brown flip notebook faintly marked Log 67-69. The notebook was immediately sealed as it could be the truck operation log used by the Faulkner family during the period overlapping the incident. It contained numerous entries about deliveries, vehicle condition, and some crossed-out lines related to evening use of the truck. Several dates in December 1968 were circled but had no notes. This particularly drew the investigation team's attention. Additionally, in a metal drawer, they found a stack of old yellowed letters, including several sent to Brandon from a former co-worker, expressing worry about old matters being dug up. Though the letters did not directly mention the Hathaway family, the evasive language and references to things that cannot be changed were considered additional clues linking Brandon to the case. All documents were seized and transported immediately to the Columbia County Evidence Room for detailed analysis. Meanwhile, Brandon was taken to the county jail, undergoing fingerprinting and booking photos. Unlike the angry or panicked reactions often seen in serious cases, he maintained tense silence, his eyes constantly shifting as if searching for a reasonable explanation for what was happening. When brought into the room for the reading of the charges, the district attorney, accompanied by 2 officers, read the full indictment. First-degree murder of Eli Hathaway. first-degree murder of Marilyn Hathaway, first-degree murder of Lucy Hathaway, and first-degree murder of Thomas Hathaway, along with charges of evidence tampering and intentional destruction of case-related property. The indictment detailed, in a thorough but neutral manner, the entire chain of forensic evidence, red paint samples matching the Faulkner truck, victim's skull fractures consistent with impacts from the truck and rearview mirror, DNA confirming all Hathaway family members' identities, truck travel path simulations leading directly to the excavation sites, and discovery of the submerged truck under Devil's Lake, with a chassis number matching the Faulkner family's 1967 registration. When the reading concluded, Brandon simply sat silently without reaction, but his silence was not calm. It resembled the paralysis of someone who knew the layers of evidence had stacked up to an undeniable level. The reading of the charges marked the most significant legal moment in the case since 1968. For the first time in the file's history, a suspect was not only named but formally charged based on a chain of evidence too clear to deny. Brandon Faulkner was returned to his cell to await his initial hearing. While outside police headquarters, news of the arrest spread quickly through local media channels, signaling an irreversible turning point in a case that had lain dormant for over 40 years. Immediately after being arrested and read the charges, Brandon Faulkner was taken to the formal interrogation room at the Columbia County Police Headquarters. The interrogation room was recorded according to modern standards, with 2 cameras mounted in the corners and a screen displaying the time continuously. Lieutenant Harlan, along with investigator Reed, handled the first interrogation session, with the goal of recording Brandon's direct statement before his defense attorney could adjust the strategy. Initially, Brandon appeared tense, but tried to maintain a calm demeanor, stating that he had nothing to do with it and didn't understand why he was arrested. When asked about the night of December 14, 1968, he repeated his old claim: he was at home, had not left the farm after 5 p.m., and had not used the International Harvester truck that night. When Harlan placed in front of him a copy of the red paint analysis results, proving that the paint streak on the station wagon door matched 100% with the Faulkner truck, Brandon changed his statement for the first time. He said maybe someone borrowed the truck without him knowing. Reed immediately pointed out that this statement contradicted his previous claim that no one else had ever used the truck. When the timeline structure was clearly presented, Brandon changed it a second time. He said the truck might have been sideswiped by someone at night, but he could not explain why the paint layer on Eli's skull matched the family truck's paint. When asked about the truck found submerged in Devil's Lake, Brandon said the truck was stolen, and he had never known where it was after 1968. However, Reed presented the vehicle frame number, VIN, found on the submerged truck, which matched perfectly with the family's vehicle, and asked why a stolen truck would sink in a location near the trail where the Hathaway family disappeared. Brandon did not answer, only looking down at the table. The third statement change came when Harlan placed in front of him restored images of the collision damage on the station wagon door. When asked if he had driven the truck that night and accidentally hit Eli, Brandon said a collision might have happened, but he didn't remember anything because it was too long ago. However, when asked why he had never reported the accident in 1968, Brandon fell silent. Reed continued the interrogation by presenting a 3-dimensional simulated trajectory. He placed the simulation printout on the table and asked Brandon to explain why only a 1967 International Harvester truck could create a paint transfer streak at the height matching the station wagon door. Brandon replied that the simulation was just hypothetical, but Reed immediately countered that the simulation was based on the actual dimensions of the truck, bed height, metal deformation location, and paint marks, not speculation. When evidence regarding Thomas's body was presented, including the matching rearview mirror fragment, chrome adhered in the skull fracture, and burial location, exactly 1 mile from the Faulkner farm, Brandon changed his statement for the 4th time. He said maybe someone else in the family used the truck that night. Harlan gently reminded him that in 1968, Brandon was the only one on the farm with a driver's license, and the habit of driving at night, according to his own previous statements in old records. When asked who in his family could have caused the deaths of the entire Hathaway family, Brandon did not answer. A series of other questions were raised about the 1967-69 truck logbook found in the storage shed. Brandon denied writing the crossed-out lines, but the handwriting was confirmed by experts to match his signature on vehicle registration papers. When Reed presented the logbook page, circled for December 14, 1968, with no entry, an anomaly compared to the habit of clearly noting every trip, Brandon said that was just a coincidence. However, when asked why many December pages had faint erasures, he said he didn't remember why he erased them. Each of his answers opened up new contradictions. When forensics were brought directly into the interrogation, every point refuted Brandon's statements. 1. He said the truck never left the farm, but soil samples from the station wagon matched the Faulkner land area where the simulation showed the truck had stopped. 2. He said he didn't hit anyone, but the paint on Eli's skull completely matched the Faulkner truck paint and appeared inside the fracture, meaning the collision occurred while Eli was still alive. 3. He said he had no connection to the burial locations, but all three graves were precisely on the only route the truck could have taken after the collision. 4. He said he didn't know when the truck sank, but the frame showed it sank within hours of Eli's death, due to fresh mud adhered at that time. Each forensic argument was presented like a sharp cut into the stories Brandon tried to build. At the end of the 6-hour interrogation, he no longer offered new statements and simply sat silently, avoiding looking at the evidence placed in front of him. That silence, along with the constant illogical changes in his statements, was recorded in the interrogation transcript as an important factor showing Brandon could not explain any contradictory points between his words and the forensic results. As he stepped out of the interrogation room, Lieutenant Harlan knew that even though Brandon had not confessed, the case file for charges had become strong enough to hold up in court because forensics had spoken in place of what the suspect could not refute. The trial of Brandon Faulkner opened in March 2011 at the Columbia County Court, attracting widespread media and local residents after the indictment for killing 4 members of the Hathaway family was widely announced. From the early days, the prosecution established its strategic focus. Instead of concentrating on the defendant's contradictory statements, they placed the full weight on forensic evidence and digital reconstruction, objective evidence that was hard to refute and did not depend on anyone's memory or willingness to confess. At the trial, the prosecution presented a 3D model simulating the entire 1968 scene, using historical terrain data, restored photos from old records, and physical specifications of the 2 vehicles. When the model appeared on the large screen, the entire courtroom fell silent. Against the backdrop of the snow-covered trail, the station wagon appeared moving slowly, while the Faulkner family's International Harvester truck approached from the front left. At the simulated collision point, the truck bed swept strongly across the edge of the driver's door, creating exactly the paint streak that investigators had analyzed. The simulation system then zoomed in on the contact area, displaying the exact height of the truck bed edge, matching the paint streak and metal deformation. The prosecution emphasized that no other vehicle in the area in 1968 had dimensions matching to the millimeter like this. Following the simulation of the collision with the station wagon, the prosecution showed the reconstruction of the impact on Eli Hathaway. Based on the collision angle, Eli's standing position from the scene map, and Dr. Erickson's analysis, the 3D model showed Eli's head being struck against the truck bed edge, with force sufficient to cause the exact long straight fracture on the skull. The simulation continued with a 360-degree rotation, showing the material adhered to the skull at the fracture, illustrated in red in the video, matching perfectly with the red alkyd paint sample from the Faulkner truck. The prosecution asked Dr. Erickson in front of the jury, "Is there any other possibility besides the victim's head directly impacting the Faulkner truck?" Erickson replied, "No. No other object could create this fracture pattern in material transfer. Next, the prosecution moved to proving how the truck's mirror caused Thomas Hathaway's death. A highly accurate digital replica of the 1967 International Harvester rearview mirror was modeled. When the simulation was projected on the screen, the prosecution showed the mirror's edge forming a sharp flat angle, suitable for causing impact indentation damage, similar to the dent on Thomas's skull. When rotating the mirror to match the fracture direction, the model displayed a line perfectly aligning with the skull crack. Before the jury, the prosecution emphasized, "This is not assumption, this is physical matching proven to the millimeter." Subsequently, the prosecution presented the simulation of the truck's movement after the collision. The screen displayed the truck continuing a few more meters, then turning northeast, exactly matching the trajectory analysis model previously used. Arrows indicating movement showed the truck stopping near the location where Marilyn and Lucy's remains were later discovered. Based on terrain data, the simulation showed it was the only point within a half-mile radius suitable for stopping in deep snow without being visible from the main road. The prosecution explained, "We didn't choose that location, the physical data pointed to it." To clarify the disposal, the 3D simulation continued showing the truck's route, leaving the two burial pits and heading toward the shore of Devil's Lake. Based on 1968 terrain, the slope down to the lake was fully recreated. The simulation showed low speed but sufficient force for the truck to roll into the water when left driverless. The prosecution showed the simulated scene of the truck sinking, its silhouette fading in the lake, matching the location found after the 2010 drought. Next, the prosecution called the GPR expert to explain the F7 and F12 areas where Marilyn and Lucy's remains were found. The expert presented ground slices from the radar, showing clearly artificially disturbed burial pits. He explained, the soil was disturbed around 1968. No agricultural activity could produce such a response. Before the jury, he pointed out each anomalous response leading to the child and adult remains. Then, the prosecution moved to synthesizing forensics, 1 red paint matching perfectly from 3 sources, 2 Eli's skull injury, uniquely matching the truck bed edge, 3 Thomas's skull injury uniquely matching the truck mirror, 4 DNA confirming all victims, 5 truck trajectory matching all burial locations, 6 submerged truck with fully matching VIN to the Faulkner vehicle. When the prosecution asked Dr. Erickson if the probability of all these matches being coincidental, he replied succinctly, near zero. The prosecution concluded its presentation with decisive words, "It's not just one piece of evidence incriminating Brandon Faulkner, it's dozens of independent pieces of evidence from different fields, forensics, geophysics, digital simulation, DNA, materials, all pointing in one direction. And that direction is the defendant." At the end, the prosecution looked straight at the jury and concluded, "We are not here to speculate, we are here because the truth has been proven." The courtroom atmosphere fell silent. The facts once buried in the 1968 snow and ice were now clearly visible to all. After more than 8 weeks of trial with hundreds of forensic evidence, digital simulations and expert testimonies, the jury officially entered deliberations. Just 4 hours later, an unexpectedly short time for a case spanning over 40 years, they returned with a unanimous verdict, Brandon Faulkner guilty of first-degree murder for the 4 members of the Hathaway family. As the judge read the sentence, the courtroom was dead silent. The court sentences defendant Brandon Faulkner to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for each victim. The sentences to be served consecutively. Each pronounced sentence was like closing the final door on debates that had dragged on since 1968. Brandon sat motionless, hands clenched, but no reaction, while a few Hathaway family relatives shed tears in the gallery. The sentence not only ended a trial, but also officially closed a painful chapter that had overshadowed the community for over half a century. Immediately after sentencing, the Columbia County Police Department began procedures to update all old files. The 1968 Hathaway family missing persons case, previously classified as missing persons, undetermined cause, was changed to homicide, multiple victims, with date of death December 14, 1968, and perpetrator confirmed as Brandon Faulkner. This decision was documented to ensure that initial investigative errors would never be overlooked or repeated. Changing the file classification was not just administrative procedure, but a belated recognition that the victims had not simply disappeared, they had been murdered and hidden beneath the very snow and ice of Wisconsin that year. The post-trial forensic summary report was compiled over more than 3 months, over 700 pages thick, becoming one of the most detailed post-investigation analyses ever produced in Wisconsin. The report clearly outlined the main errors in the 1968 investigation, starting with the scene being assessed too early, as no signs of foul play, reliance on visual observation instead of collecting paint samples, lack of equipment to identify faint tire marks, and failure to expand the search toward Faulkner Land, the location that 2010 terrain simulation proved was the only route the truck could have taken. The report also emphasized that the blizzard weather had obscured most clues, but more regrettably, the remaining small details, like the red paint streak, were not tested more deeply at the time. Despite 1968 technological limitations, forensic experts noted that proper investigative focus could have prevented the case from stalling for decades. In the final evaluation section, the report stated, "If the case occurred today, the combination of GPR, 3D simulation, material analysis, and targeted excavation would solve it within months." The 42-year delay highlights the importance of evidence preservation and standardized scene investigation. A separate chapter in the report was dedicated to describing how the digital reconstruction project changed the investigation's direction. The technical team detailed the process of overlaying 1967 terrain maps with scene data, determining the truck's movement trajectory, and reaching conclusions that led investigators to the burial sites of Marilyn and Lucy. The report wrote, "No single piece of evidence could solve the case alone, but when synthesized and cross-verified, the entire forensic chain pointed to the same truth. It was the coordination of modern technologies that did not exist when the crime occurred, that provided the answer two previous generations of police could not find." The Wisconsin Forensic Council, upon reviewing the summary report, classified the Hathaway-Faulkner case as a standard case study for cold case investigation and recommended including it in forensic training curricula. In its conclusion, the council emphasized 3 benchmarks: 1. Scene reconstruction via digital simulation to fill investigative gaps. 2. Prioritizing physical evidence over changeable statements. 3. GPR scanning and targeted excavation for locating victims in long-term missing persons cases. The case became proof that modern forensics can not only solve new cases, but also revive those thought forever dormant in archives. Wisconsin media described the case as a living training program where every past mistake was re-examined under the light of modern science. The court also issued an official statement praising the perseverance of the 2010-2011 investigation team, emphasizing that justice for the Hathaway family came late, but never too late. In the final press conference for the case, Lieutenant Harlan spoke in a calm, low voice. "The most heartbreaking thing is that 42 years passed while the truth lay right beneath the soil, mud and waters of Devil's Lake. The most important lesson we learned is every missing persons case, even without immediate evidence, deserves to be investigated as a serious crime until proven otherwise." Closing the Hathaway investigation file, the report ended with the line, "This case will be the standard for all future cold case investigations." A testament that time may bury the truth, but modern forensics can dig it back up. Looking back at the entire Hathaway case in the context of the United States today, what is most haunting is not only the chain of crimes hidden for 42 years, but also the breakdowns in the initial investigation, flaws that allowed a family to disappear almost without a trace. The overlooked red paint streak, unanalyzed faint tire marks, and the quick conclusion of missing without clear cause reflect a lesson still relevant. Every small detail can be the key to justice, and overlooking just one clue can bury the entire truth under time. In the current United States, where forensics and investigative technology have advanced tremendously, the Hathaway case shows why communities still need to support funding for forensics, in-depth investigator training, and long-term evidence storage. If the paint sample from the station wagon door had not been preserved in 1968, 2010 forensics could not have proven the perfect match with the Faulkner truck. If the 1967-69 truck logbook had not been seized, the timeline could not be reconstructed. If GPR had not been used, Marilyn and Lucy's bodies might still lie beneath the soil. Another lesson: the silence of time is not innocence. Brandon Faulkner lived over 4 decades as an ordinary citizen, illustrating the reality that many perpetrators can blend into society unsuspected if persistent investigation is lacking. Therefore, what is important in American life today is believing in the value of reviewing cold cases, continuing to submit tips, and not ignoring collective memory. Ultimately, the Hathaway case reminds us that justice may come late, but only when community, investigators, and science work together. And for every person in American society, the takeaway is pay attention to anomalies, report promptly, and believe that the truth, no matter how long submerged in the devil's lake of life, can still be brought to light. Thank you for joining us in exploring the Hathaway case, a testament that the truth can be buried for decades, but justice cannot. Please subscribe to the channel to continue unlocking other mysterious cases with us in the next video.